This episode is not just another exploration of philosophy. It's not about the common, well-worn ideas you might expect. Instead, we'll dive into niche, lesser-known philosophies that challenge and expand our perspectives on life, existence, and meaning. These dark and complex philosophies have the potential to reshape the way we view the world, pushing us to confront questions most would rather avoid. So let's begin this journey into the depths of these unsettling, thought-provoking ideas. The void is one of the most unsettling concepts in philosophy, cosmology, and metaphysics. It refers not just to emptiness, but to a space where everything is absent, a place beyond existence, matter, and time. To truly grasp the void, we must explore it through various lenses, from ancient philosophy to modern physics, where it takes on dimensions both abstract and tangible. In ancient Greece, philosophers were already grappling with the nature of nothingness. Parmenides, for example, argued that the void simply could not exist. In his view, if there was truly nothing somewhere, it would be indistinguishable from being, making the concept of a void incoherent. For Parmenides, reality was a continuous, unbroken whole, and the notion of nothingness was a philosophical impossibility. On the other hand, Democritus, one of the early atomists, suggested that the void was not only real but necessary. For him, the universe was composed of indivisible atoms moving through the void. Without this empty space between atoms, motion would be impossible. Thus the void became the stage upon which all physical interactions played out, even if it was itself nothing. Eastern philosophical traditions have their own conceptions of the void, which often emphasize its role in the nature of reality and consciousness. In Buddhism, for example, sunyata, often translated as emptiness or void, is a central concept. However, this void is not a nihilistic nothingness. It refers to the idea that all things are empty of inherent, independent existence. Everything is interconnected and interdependent, meaning that the self and the world are, in essence, void of a separate, enduring reality. This is a deeply meditative understanding of the void. Far from being something to fear, it is a state of awareness that dissolves the boundaries between subject and object, self and other. In this sense, the void is a path to enlightenment, offering freedom from the illusions of permanence and ego. In modern physics, the concept of the void takes on an even more intriguing role. At first glance, outer space might seem like the closest approximation to the void, an infinite stretch of nothingness between stars and galaxies. However, modern cosmology reveals that even the most empty parts of space are far from empty. The vacuum of space, which we might call a void, is actually teeming with activity. Quantum physics tells us that even in a perfect vacuum, virtual particles are constantly popping in and out of existence. This is the result of quantum fluctuations, tiny energy imbalances that momentarily create particles before they annihilate each other. What appears to be empty space is, at the quantum level, a seething, dynamic field of energy and potential. This paradoxical idea that the void is not truly empty challenges our most basic assumptions about reality. In fact, the entire universe may have emerged from such a quantum void. One of the leading theories of cosmology, called the inflationary model, suggests that our universe began as a quantum fluctuation in a vacuum. In this sense, the void is not a place of absence, but a wellspring of potential, a cosmic backdrop from which everything we see and experience has emerged. Beyond physics and philosophy, the concept of the void resonates deeply with human psychology and existential thought. We encounter the void in moments of profound loss or meaninglessness. Think of the existential crises described by thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre or Albert Camus, who grapple with the absurdity of life, the confrontation between our desire for meaning and the apparent indifference of the universe. For Sartre, the void is not just an abstract concept, but a fundamental part of human consciousness. He argued that we are condemned to be free. In other words, we are responsible for imbuing our lives with meaning in a universe that offers none. This freedom can be exhilarating, but it can also be terrifying, as it leaves us face to face with the void of meaninglessness. Camus, too, confronts the void, particularly in his notion of the absurd. The universe, he argues, does not offer inherent meaning, yet humans continually seek it. This disconnect creates the absurd condition, an existential void that we must either accept or rebel against. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus famously compares the human condition to that of Sisyphus, a figure from Greek mythology who is condemned to roll a boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll back down for eternity. For Camus, true freedom lies in embracing the absurd and finding personal meaning in the face of an indifferent void. Interestingly, the void is not always viewed as a negative or terrifying concept. In many philosophical and spiritual traditions, it is seen as a space of potential where creation and transformation can occur. In Taoism, for instance, the Tao is often associated with the void. The Tao is the source of all things, yet it is formless, empty, and beyond human comprehension. From this void emerges the 10,000 things, the infinite diversity of the universe. Similarly, in modern art and literature, the void often symbolizes the unknown, the uncharted, and the limitless. It is a space where imagination, creativity, and radical change are possible. In this way, the void is not a place of nothingness, but a fertile ground for new possibilities. In confronting the void, we encounter both the deepest mysteries of the universe and the most profound questions of human existence. Whether it's the quantum void that gave rise to the cosmos, the existential void that challenges our sense of meaning, or the spiritual void that promises enlightenment, the void is far from empty. It is a concept that demands we look beyond surface appearances and grapple with the fundamental nature of reality itself. Rather than fear the void, we might consider it a mirror, a reflection of both the limitations and the boundless potential of human understanding. In its emptiness, we find both uncertainty and the possibility of something new. The void, then, is not just a philosophical or scientific puzzle. It is an essential part of the human experience. Heidegger's being toward death. Heidegger's being toward death is a profound concept that delves into the human relationship with death, drawing from existential philosophy. Martin Heidegger, one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century, presents this idea in his 1927 work, Being and Time for Heidegger. Death is not merely a biological event that marks the end of life. It is a fundamental aspect of what it means to be human. Our awareness of death shapes our existence and influences how we live. To unpack the concept of being toward death, let's first consider how most of us approach death in our everyday lives. Typically, death is something we avoid thinking about. It's abstract, distant, and often regarded as something that happens to others, not to us. Heidegger refers to this attitude as inauthentic living, an evasion of our true nature and reality. But what happens when we face death directly? This is where Heidegger's concept of being toward death becomes critical. Instead of treating death as a distant possibility, he argues that we should confront it as a core aspect of our existence. By doing so, we begin to live more authentically. Imagine your life as a story, a novel you're constantly writing. Most of us write our story with a vague idea that the ending exists somewhere, but we rarely think about it. We get caught up in the twists and turns of daily life, in the plots and subplots of career, relationships, and ambitions. But here's the thing. The story is finite. It will end. And the knowledge of that inevitable end, the fact that your life has a conclusion, changes the way you write the rest of your story. In this analogy, Heidegger suggests that most people live as though the end of the story doesn't matter or isn't real. They go through life distracted, immersed in mundane concerns, not fully embracing the reality of death. This is living inauthentically, in Heidegger's terms. But what if, instead, you approached life knowing that each chapter could be your last? What if you lived with the acute awareness that death is not some distant ending but an ever-present possibility? This doesn't mean living in fear, but living with a heightened sense of responsibility for how you choose to write each day. This awareness, according to Heidegger, is what leads to authentic living, what he calls being toward death. Being toward death is about embracing death as a fact of our existence. This acknowledgement doesn't necessarily come with a sense of doom or morbid fixation, but with clarity. When you fully grasp that your life is finite, you also realize that time is limited, and therefore precious. Each moment, each decision becomes more significant. Heidegger believed that living authentically meant acknowledging that we are beings who are always moving towards death. This doesn't mean obsessing over death, but rather letting its inevitability guide us in our choices. When we accept that death is not just a far-off event, but an integral part of who we are, we start to prioritize what truly matters. Consider a person on their deathbed. Often they reflect not on the mundane details of life, like how many meetings they attended or how much money they made, but on deeper questions. How well did I love? Did I live according to my own values? Did I make the most of my time? Heidegger's being toward death encourages us to ask these questions now, rather than waiting until death is imminent. It urges us to live with the awareness that death is not just the final chapter, but the silent backdrop to every moment of our lives. For Heidegger, the acknowledgement of death leads to a kind of existential anxiety, or what he calls angst. This isn't the fear of dying itself, but a deeper, more profound anxiety that arises when we realize the fragility and impermanence of our existence. It's the unsettling recognition that our lives have no fixed meaning or guarantees. We are thrown into the world, and we must create meaning for ourselves while knowing that all of it will ultimately end. This can be a frightening realization, but for Heidegger, it's also liberating. In confronting the reality of death, we break free from the distractions and illusions of everyday life. We stop clinging to false securities, like societal expectations or material success, and begin to take ownership of our own existence. In a way, death becomes the key to living authentically. One might compare this existential angst to standing on the edge of a vast, empty abyss. It's terrifying to look into the void, but it's also an opportunity to recognize that since nothing is fixed, you have the freedom to create your own path. This recognition can lead to what Heidegger calls a resoluteness, a commitment to live in accordance with your own deepest values, fully aware of your mortality. Another important aspect of Heidegger's being toward death is the role it plays in defining individuality. Death is the one thing we cannot share with anyone else. It is entirely personal and unique. No one can die your death for you. In this sense, our mortality sets us apart as individuals, forcing us to confront the fact that our lives are singular and unrepeatable. This realization can lead to a deeper sense of individuality and authenticity. When you fully grasp that your life is yours alone, that you alone are responsible for how you live it, you begin to take ownership of your choices in a profound way. You stop living according to the expectations of others or societal norms, and start living in a way that is true to yourself. Heidegger's concept of being toward death offers a pathway to a more meaningful life. By confronting death rather than avoiding or denying it, we gain a clearer understanding of what it means to live authentically. It's not about fearing death, but about using the awareness of our mortality to sharpen our focus on what truly matters. Just as a story is shaped by its ending, so too is life given meaning by the fact that it will end. In embracing this, we can live more fully, more deliberately, and more authentically, writing each chapter of our lives with intention, knowing that the end is always near, but that it is our own story to shape. Quietism. Quietism is a philosophical and spiritual approach that advocates for mental stillness and the relinquishment of intellectual effort in the face of ultimate truth. It suggests that the pursuit of complex knowledge, or the attempt to rationally solve life's deepest mysteries, is ultimately futile. Instead, quietists argue for a sort of inner silence or detachment from the noise of the world, both external and mental, as the only way to approach true peace or enlightenment. In many ways, quietism resembles strands of mysticism, Eastern philosophy, and certain existentialist ideas, though it's most closely associated with Christian mysticism, especially figures like Miguel de Molinos in the 17th century. To understand quietism, it's helpful to first look at what it opposes, the restless, ceaseless quest for intellectual answers. In quietism, this quest is seen as an endless loop, a kind of mental chatter that only distances one from peace. In Western philosophy, much of intellectual history has revolved around constructing complex systems of thought. Thinkers from Aristotle to Descartes to Kant worked tirelessly to categorize reality, to uncover truth, and to resolve the nature of existence. For quietists, this intellectual effort is a distraction from what truly matters, the ability to live peacefully and authentically in the present moment. Imagine that you're standing on the shore of a vast ocean, trying to figure out how deep it is by throwing rocks into the water and watching how they splash. Each rock represents a thought or theory you're throwing at the world in an attempt to measure its depth, to grasp its nature. But no matter how many rocks you throw, you never really find out how deep the ocean is. All you do is disturb the surface, causing waves and ripples that obscure the water below. Quietism advises that you stop throwing rocks. Instead of measuring, seeking, or struggling for control, you are to sit quietly by the ocean, allowing its depths to reveal themselves or remain mysterious without your interference. In the 20th century, the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein took up a kind of philosophical quietism in his later work. Wittgenstein famously argued that many philosophical problems arise because of the limitations and confusions inherent in language. For him, these so-called problems are often nothing more than linguistic puzzles, knots of words that we tie ourselves into. The solution, Wittgenstein suggests, is not to solve these problems through more elaborate theories, but to dissolve them by recognizing their illusory nature. In his later masterpiece, Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein famously remarked, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." Here, Wittgenstein isn't merely advocating for literal silence, but for a recognition of the boundaries of language and thought. His quietist streak emerges in his belief that many philosophical dilemmas don't need resolution, but rather recognition that they cannot be resolved within the confines of human thought or speech. By stopping the intellectual pursuit, one might achieve a form of clarity, or at least an end to confusion. Quietism doesn't just suggest intellectual stillness, but emotional and spiritual stillness as well. One of the core ideas is that by withdrawing from the noise of the world, the constant need to act, judge, solve, and pursue, we can reach a kind of inner tranquility. This idea is similar to concepts found in Eastern philosophies, particularly Taoism and certain interpretations of Buddhism. In Taoism, for instance, the notion of wu-wei or non-action aligns well with quietism. Wu-wei doesn't literally mean doing nothing. It refers to action that is in harmony with the flow of life, where one doesn't force outcomes or struggle against the natural order. Similarly, quietism suggests that by not mentally struggling with the complexities of life, we align ourselves with a deeper sense of peace. A practical analogy for this might be the experience of trying to solve a difficult personal problem. Imagine you're desperately trying to figure out what direction to take in life, whether to change careers, move to a new city, or pursue a new relationship. The more you think about it, the more tangled your thoughts become. You weigh the pros and cons, you consult others, and you exhaust yourself mentally. But in a quietist spirit, instead of solving the problem through endless analysis, you might sit in silence, allowing the noise to subside. Over time, clarity often arises, not through effort, but through a kind of mental stillness. This is the quietist path, clarity through non-effort. Quietism has often been criticized, particularly by those who value active engagement with the world. Critics argue that quietism, by advocating for a kind of detachment, could lead to passivity and withdrawal from necessary action. If we stop pursuing knowledge or cease to engage with life's challenges, does this mean we give up on improving the world or ourselves? The quietist would respond that this is a misunderstanding of their approach. Quietism isn't about total withdrawal or passivity. It's about the right kind of engagement. Instead of wrestling with life in an attempt to bend it to our will, quietism encourages a kind of surrender to the flow of reality. Rather than disengaging from the world, the quietist remains open to it, but without the obsessive need to control, change, or understand everything at a deep intellectual level. The quietist response to suffering, for example, would not be to ignore it, but to accept it without resistance. In a world full of uncertainty, quietism offers a way to be at peace with what we don't and can't know. Instead of endlessly striving for certainty and control, quietism, then, is not a doctrine of disengagement, but one of deep acceptance. It invites us to move beyond the noisy world of constant intellectual striving and emotional turmoil, guiding us instead toward a peaceful stillness where truth is not something to be grasped, but something to be experienced in silence. It's a way of living that prioritizes mental clarity, inner calm, and a humble recognition of the limits of human understanding. In this sense, quietism can be seen not as a rejection of life's problems, but as a different way of approaching them, by allowing life to unfold without the relentless attempt to control or explain it. The absurd. The absurd is a central concept in existential philosophy, particularly associated with the work of Albert Camus. At its core, the absurd refers to the fundamental conflict between human beings' desire for meaning, order, and understanding in life, and the cold, indifferent universe that offers no such guarantees. The clash between this longing for coherence and the reality of an incomprehensible, chaotic existence creates what Camus termed the absurd condition. To understand the absurd, imagine a person standing on the edge of a cliff, staring out into a vast, empty void. They scream into the abyss, hoping for a response, for some echo of meaning to come back. But the void remains silent. This is the human experience, according to Camus, a yearning for significance, for an answer to the question, why, met by an unresponsive, meaningless universe. Camus famously illustrated this conflict in his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus, a figure from Greek mythology, is condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down every time he reaches the summit. For all eternity, he repeats this fruitless task. To Camus, Sisyphus symbolizes the human condition, our endless pursuit of meaning and purpose, even though the universe offers none. Life, like Sisyphus's boulder, appears to be an endless cycle of striving, without a final resolution or inherent purpose. The absurd lies in recognizing that, no matter how much we seek to impose order on the world, it remains indifferent and irrational. But what are we to do with this realization? Faced with the absurd, we have several options, and these are the heart of Camus's philosophy. The first is suicide, which Camus rejects outright. If life has no meaning, some might argue, why continue living? But Camus saw this as a negation of the very experience of life itself, a surrender to despair. It's an escape, not a solution. The second option is to take a leap of faith, to believe in something greater, such as religion or some ultimate cosmic order that provides meaning where none is apparent. This is what many have done throughout history, turning to gods or metaphysical beliefs to fill the void. But for Camus, this leap of faith is a form of philosophical dishonesty. It requires one to reject the evidence of the absurd and to pretend that meaning exists where it does not. It's a rejection of reason in favor of comfort. Camus advocates a third option, to embrace the absurd fully and live in defiance of it. He calls this revolt. Instead of searching for meaning or turning away from the absurd, we can accept it as an essential part of the human condition. The challenge, then, is to live fully and passionately in the face of this absurdity. Rather than seeking external meaning, we find meaning in our experiences, our actions, and our rebellion against a meaningless universe. We may be rolling the boulder up the mountain endlessly, but we can find joy in the effort itself. As Camus famously concluded in the myth of Sisyphus, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Let's return to the cliff edge analogy. After realizing that the void won't answer, we could either step off the cliff in despair, or we could turn away from the edge, walk back into the world, and live with full knowledge of the absurd. This doesn't mean we ignore the absurdity of existence. Rather, we confront it head-on and make the most of our lives, knowing they are fleeting and without inherent meaning. We build meaning through our choices, actions, and relationships. For many, the absurd is initially a dark and depressing notion, but upon deeper reflection, it can be profoundly liberating. In accepting that there is no ultimate meaning, we are free from the pressure to find one. The absurd strips away false hopes and illusions, leaving us with the raw experience of life itself. Instead of living for some imagined future goal or divine purpose, we can focus on the present, the immediate, and the real. This is where we find our freedom, by acknowledging that nothing is predetermined, and that we are the authors of our own existence. In modern life, the absurd can manifest in countless ways. The repetitive nature of daily routines, the pursuit of success in a world that offers no guarantees, the contrast between human suffering and the vast, uncaring universe, all of these highlight the absurd. Yet, even in the midst of this, we find moments of beauty, joy, and connection. It's the recognition that these moments are fleeting and fragile that gives them their power. In conclusion, the absurd is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be lived with. It asks us to confront the tension between our desire for meaning and the world's refusal to provide it, and to continue living fully in spite of it. It invites us to embrace the freedom that comes from accepting the absurd, and to craft our own meaning through the act of living. Kierkegaard's leap of faith, Søren Kierkegaard, often called the father of existentialism, introduced the concept of the leap of faith to explain a profound decision one must make when confronted with the limits of reason and the uncertainty of life. The leap of faith isn't just a religious decision. It's a deep existential response to the human condition. When faced with an ambiguous or paradoxical world, Kierkegaard believed we must make a personal commitment, despite the impossibility of knowing outcomes with absolute certainty. To understand the leap of faith, we must first explore Kierkegaard's broader philosophy, which is anchored in the individual's confrontation with despair, uncertainty, and the need for personal choice. Kierkegaard criticized the rationalism and objectivity of his time, arguing that while reason has its place, it fails to provide answers to life's most profound and personal questions, particularly questions of meaning, morality, and faith. For Kierkegaard, the human experience is marked by a fundamental tension. We are finite beings, living in a world where many things are beyond our control, yet we have the capacity for infinite imagination, dreams, and desires. This tension often leads to despair, as we struggle to reconcile the limitations of our existence with the endless possibilities our minds can conjure. Despair, for Kierkegaard, is the existential condition that arises when we attempt to find meaning or certainty in things that ultimately fail us, whether those things are external, like wealth or social status, or internal, like our own rationality or morality. In his work, The Sickness Unto Death, he discusses this despair in detail, explaining that it emerges when individuals fail to align their existence with their true self, or fail to confront the impossibility of finding absolute certainty in life. In this condition of despair, the individual faces a choice: continue searching for certainty in finite or rational things, which will inevitably fail, or take a leap of faith into the unknown. Kierkegaard's leap of faith does not refer to blind belief or irrationality. It's more profound than that. It's an acknowledgement that, at some point, reason reaches its limits. When we reach the boundaries of what we can understand, we are faced with an unavoidable choice: either retreat into nihilism and despair, or take a risk, making a personal commitment without the security of certainty. Kierkegaard famously illustrated this in the story of Abraham from the Bible, particularly in Fear and Trembling, his most well-known work on faith. Abraham was asked by God to sacrifice his son, Isaac. From a rational standpoint, this command makes no sense. It contradicts moral understanding, and there is no guarantee that obeying it will lead to any good. Yet, Abraham chooses to act out of faith, trusting in the absurdity of the divine command, even though he has no reason or evidence to support that trust. This is the essence of Kierkegaard's leap. Abraham does not rely on rational calculation or the certainty of outcomes. Instead, he leaps into the absurdity of faith, trusting in something greater than reason, despite the paradox it presents. Kierkegaard calls this the teleological suspension of the ethical, where faith transcends human logic and moral reasoning. Kierkegaard placed great emphasis on the individual and the subjective nature of truths. He argued that the most important truths, such as the meaning of life, the existence of God, or the nature of love, cannot be proven or objectively verified. These truths are personal, existential, and must be discovered through one's own lived experience. The leap of faith is a personal act, grounded in the subjective experience of the individual. It is not something that can be universally applied or rationally defended, but rather a commitment that one makes in the face of uncertainty. For Kierkegaard, this is where authentic existence begins. It is only by confronting the absurdity and ambiguity of life and choosing to act in the face of that uncertainty that we can truly live authentically. To put it another way, Kierkegaard believed that human beings cannot simply follow a prescribed path laid out by society, religion, or rational thought. Each person must take responsibility for their own life, make their own choices, and ultimately take a leap of faith when confronted with the limits of reason. This is not an easy task. It requires courage and the willingness to embrace uncertainty. At the heart of Kierkegaard's leap of faith is the paradox of faith itself. Faith, for him, is inherently paradoxical because it involves believing in something that seems impossible or absurd from a rational perspective. In the case of Abraham, faith meant believing that God would somehow fulfill his promise to Abraham, that he would become the father of nations, even as he commanded Abraham to kill his only son. This paradox is crucial to understanding the leap of faith. Faith does not arise out of evidence or reason. It arises precisely when evidence and reason fail. It is a response to the absurdity of existence, the contradictions we encounter in life, and the inability of rational thought to resolve these contradictions. The leap of faith, therefore, is not about rejecting reason, but about going beyond it. It is about accepting that, in certain aspects of life, particularly matters of meaning, morality, and the divine, there are no guarantees or certainties. And yet, in the face of this uncertainty, we must still choose, act, and live. To understand the leap of faith in modern terms, imagine standing at the edge of a vast, fog-covered canyon. You can't see the other side, and the fog is so thick that you have no idea whether there's a bridge ahead or if you'll fall into the abyss. Rationally, you have no way of knowing what lies before you, but you're not paralyzed by indecision. You take a leap, not because you know for certain you'll land safely, but because you've made a personal commitment to move forward in life, even in the face of uncertainty. This leap, Kierkegaard would argue, is what makes life meaningful. It's the act of choosing to live authentically and with conviction, despite the inherent ambiguity and paradox of existence. Solipsism. Solipsism is a philosophical position that asserts that only one's own mind is sure to exist. At its most basic level, it posits that knowledge outside of one's own consciousness is inherently unreliable. In other words, solipsism suggests that everything we perceive, people, objects, and even the universe itself could all be illusions generated by our minds. You can never truly know for certain if anything beyond your own thoughts is real. To illustrate this, imagine you're sitting in a cafe, sipping coffee. Around you, people are chatting, the hum of conversation and the clinking of cups filling the air. But solipsism raises a question. How do you know those people actually exist? How do you know the cafe is real, or even the coffee in your cup? All of your experiences are mediated through your senses and interpreted by your brain. What if everything outside your mind is merely a construct, an intricate dream that feels real but has no actual substance? The allure of solipsism stems from the fact that we rely solely on our own minds to interpret the world. Every perception we have, sight, sound, touch, and even emotions, is processed within our consciousness. But what if our minds are the only things that exist? What if everything else is just a projection, a product of imagination? Solipsism forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge, shaking the foundations of what we take for granted as reality. Let's consider an example from modern technology. Virtual reality is becoming increasingly immersive, allowing people to enter digital worlds that feel almost as real as the physical one. When you put on a VR headset, your senses tell you that you are flying over a city or exploring an alien planet. You see the landscape, feel the motion, and interact with objects, even though none of it actually exists. For all intents and purposes, while you're in the virtual world, it feels real. This experience closely mirrors the core idea of solipsism. If your mind can create a convincing illusion through technology, how can you be sure that the everyday world around you isn't just another layer of illusion? But solipsism isn't merely a thought experiment. It delves into deeper questions about the nature of consciousness and reality. If your mind is the only certainty, how can you trust that others have independent existences? Solipsism implies that other people might be mere figments of your imagination without thoughts, feelings, or awareness of their own. This is where solipsism intersects with the philosophical problem known as other minds. You can never directly experience another person's consciousness. You can observe their actions and hear their words. But how can you be certain they experience the world as you do? Solipsism takes this uncertainty to the extreme. Maybe there are no other minds at all. One of the most famous philosophical explorations of solipsism comes from the 17th century French philosopher René Descartes. In his famous Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes embarks on a journey to doubt everything he previously believed, stripping away all assumptions to find what, if anything, is certain. He eventually arrives at his famous conclusion, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Descartes' insight was that the one thing he couldn't doubt was his own existence as a thinking being. Even if everything else were an illusion, the fact that he was doubting meant that something, his mind, must exist. While Descartes didn't fully embrace solipsism, his radical doubt laid the groundwork for it by emphasizing the centrality of the self in the search for knowledge. Solipsism, however, is not without its challenges. Most philosophers find it deeply unsatisfactory as a worldview, primarily because it leads to a dead end in terms of practical living. If you genuinely believed that nothing exists beyond your own mind, why would you care about anyone else's well-being? Why would you bother to engage with the world, take risks, or even communicate? Solipsism risks sliding into a kind of nihilistic isolation, where nothing outside your own thoughts matters. It leaves no room for shared reality, social interaction, or meaningful connections with others. To counter solipsism, some philosophers argue that while our experiences of the world are subjective, the fact that other people behave in ways that seem consistent with conscious experience suggests that they do, in fact, have minds of their own. When you talk to someone, they respond in a way that implies thought, emotion, and understanding. While we can't directly observe someone else's mind, the patterns of behavior we witness seem to mirror our own mental processes. Additionally, the scientific understanding of the brain and consciousness offers a more grounded approach. Neuroscience shows that humans share similar cognitive processes, and consciousness appears to emerge from the physical brain in a consistent, predictable way across individuals. This commonality suggests that other people likely experience reality in ways similar to how we do, challenging solipsism's extreme skepticism. In conclusion, solipsism is a fascinating yet deeply unsettling perspective on reality. It forces us to grapple with the idea that everything we know might be a projection of our minds. While it raises important questions about the limits of knowledge, it ultimately leads to an isolating view of the world. Most philosophers reject solipsism because it leaves us unable to engage meaningfully with others or the universe. Nonetheless, it remains a powerful reminder of the subjective nature of experience. and the profound mystery at the heart of consciousness. Existential nihilism. Existential nihilism is a philosophical position that suggests life has no inherent meaning, value, or purpose. At its core, it confronts the unsettling question, what if nothing we do, think, or believe ultimately matters? For many, this realization can be jarring, but for others, it represents a kind of liberation, a release from the constraints of imposed meaning, allowing one to live authentically in the face of an indifferent universe. The roots of existential nihilism lie deep within existential philosophy, but the thought truly crystallized in the 19th century through thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's proclamation, "God is dead," wasn't just an announcement of religious disbelief. It was an articulation of the collapse of traditional values and a confrontation with the void left behind. With the death of an omnipotent moral authority, humanity is left alone to grapple with the harsh truth that meaning must be self-imposed, and even then it's fleeting and subjective. Imagine walking through an endless desert under a cloudless sky. The heat is oppressive, and no matter how far you walk, there's nothing on the horizon, no oasis, no destination. This is a metaphor for the human experience. In the lens of existential nihilism, the desert represents the universe, vast and indifferent, while the journey is your life, always moving forward but seemingly without purpose. The universe, according to nihilism, offers no direction, no promise of salvation, and no intrinsic reason for your steps. For some, this desert of meaninglessness breeds despair. If nothing truly matters, why make any effort at all? Why strive? Why care? Why continue? The weight of nothingness can feel suffocating, like an anchor dragging you down into a sea of apathy. This is the dark side of nihilism, where the recognition of life's lack of inherent purpose can lead to paralysis, emotional emptiness, and disillusionment. However, existential nihilism doesn't have to be viewed purely through this lens of despair. Some philosophers, like Albert Camus, challenge us to revolt against this meaninglessness. In his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus introduces us to the figure of Sisyphus, a man condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a mountain for eternity, only to watch it roll back down each time he reaches the top. For Camus, Sisyphus embodies the human condition, the endless repetition of life's tasks, the apparent futility of it all. Yet Camus encourages us to imagine Sisyphus happy. Struggle itself becomes enough. It's not the goal or outcome that matters, but the effort, the act of living in the face of absurdity. Think of it this way. If you were on a train with no clear destination in sight, you could choose to be consumed by the fact that you're uncertain where you're going. Or you could enjoy the view, the journey itself, and the moments in between. Existential nihilism invites us to understand that, while the destination may not be predetermined or meaningful, we still have the opportunity to find beauty, connection, and fulfillment along the way. The absence of inherent meaning doesn't nullify the experience. It enhances the importance of our personal choices and moments of self-created meaning. In modern times, the idea of existential nihilism resonates in a world that's increasingly interconnected, yet paradoxically feels more disconnected. The rapid pace of technological change, the vastness of the universe revealed by science, and the disintegration of traditional belief systems leave many questioning their place in the cosmos. Why are we here? What is the point? The nihilist answers, there is no grand purpose. But rather than despair, this conclusion can serve as an invitation to create personal meaning. You are not bound by anyone's script. The canvas is blank, and it is up to you to paint your story. In conclusion, existential nihilism presents a stark truth. The universe, in its infinite vastness and complexity, is indifferent to our existence. There is no intrinsic meaning waiting to be discovered. However, instead of viewing this as a source of despair, it can be seen as an opportunity for freedom. We are free to define our own purpose, to find joy in the absurdity, and to live authentically in a world that offers no ready-made answers. Free will versus determinism. Free will versus determinism is one of the oldest and most profound debates in philosophy, addressing whether we have the ability to make choices freely or if our actions are determined by forces beyond our control. The conversation revolves around the tension between human agency, our ability to choose, and the laws of nature, psychology, and biology that may govern our behavior. To understand this debate, let's start by imagining a scenario. You are at a cafe deciding between coffee or tea. You carefully weigh your mood, taste preferences, and maybe even consider the weather outside. Finally, you decide on coffee. But was that decision truly yours? Did you have the freedom to make that choice? or was it predetermined by a complex chain of prior causes, your upbringing, neurological wiring, or perhaps even the state of the universe moments before you were born? This question lies at the heart of the debate between free will and determinism. Determinism holds that every event, including human decisions, is the inevitable result of preceding causes. Just as a clock ticks in precise intervals due to its internal mechanics, determinists argue that our thoughts and actions are the results of preceding conditions, genetics, environment, and even the laws of physics. One analogy to explain determinism is that of a billiard table. Imagine a billiard ball being struck by another. The movement of the ball is entirely predictable, governed by the laws of motion, angles, and force. In a similar vein, determinists claim that everything that happens, including our thoughts and actions, results from previous events in a predictable and mechanical way. If we knew all the initial conditions of the universe and the laws of physics that govern them, we could, in theory, predict every future event. Thinkers like Baruch Spinoza and Pierre-Simon Laplace championed this view. Laplace famously hypothesized a mind, often called Laplace's demon, that if it knew the position and velocity of every particle in the universe, could predict the future with absolute certainty. According to this view, human beings are no exception. We are part of this deterministic universe, subject to the same causal laws as the inanimate objects around us. On the other side of the debate is the idea of free will, the belief that individuals can make real choices that are not predetermined. Proponents of free will argue that while there may be influences on our decisions, we still have the ability to choose among different alternatives. One of the strongest arguments for free will comes from the human experience of choice. Every day we feel as though we are choosing, whether it's deciding what to eat for lunch, which career path to pursue, or even how to respond to a friend. We feel as if we could have chosen differently. It feels real, as if something within us can override prior causes and make a genuine independent choice. Imagine a musician improvising a jazz solo. In the midst of performance, they react to the melody, the rhythm, and the mood of the room. While the musician is influenced by all these factors, the act of creation feels spontaneous, not predetermined. This is often used as an analogy for human free will, where the constraints are real, but there is still room for creativity and choice. The tension between free will and determinism arises from the fact that these two views seem mutually exclusive. If every decision is the inevitable consequence of prior causes, how can we truly be free? Yet if our actions aren't caused, what grounds our decisions in anything meaningful? A common middle ground is known as compatibilism, the idea that free will and determinism can coexist. One version of this is that while our actions are determined by prior causes, we are still free in the sense that we act according to our desires and motivations, even if those desires are themselves determined. For example, if you choose to drink coffee over tea because you prefer the taste, that decision might be determined by your preferences and experiences. However, since you acted in accordance with your own internal desires, compatibilists would argue that you are still acting freely, even though your choice was influenced by prior conditions. In recent years, neuroscience has complicated the debate. Experiments by scientists like Benjamin Libet have suggested that our brains may initiate actions before we are consciously aware of making a decision. Libet's famous experiment involved measuring brain activity while participants were asked to press a button whenever they felt the urge. The surprising result was that the brain showed signs of decision-making activity before participants were even aware of their decision to press the button. This kind of finding raises difficult questions. If our brain decides before we are consciously aware of it, where is the room for free will? Are we merely observers of our own thoughts and actions, as determinists suggest? Existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre argue that human beings are radically free, regardless of deterministic influences. According to Sartre, we are condemned to be free. Even in a deterministic universe, we still bear responsibility for how we respond to our circumstances. Sartre believes that we have no choice but to choose, and we define ourselves by the choices we make, even in the face of overwhelming external forces. This existential approach emphasizes the weight of responsibility that comes with free will. If we are truly free, then we must also bear the consequences of our actions, a sobering thought in the face of life's complexity. In the debate between free will and determinism, there is no easy answer. Determinism offers a comforting sense of order and predictability, suggesting that everything follows a logical chain of cause and effect. On the other hand, free will affirms our sense of agency and moral responsibility, suggesting that we are more than just products of past events. This clash is not just a theoretical puzzle. It touches the core of what it means to be human, forcing us to confront whether we are masters of our fate or passengers on a predetermined course. The problem of evil. The problem of evil is one of the most enduring and challenging dilemmas in philosophy and theology. It confronts a paradox that has troubled thinkers for millennia. How can an all-powerful, all-knowing, and wholly benevolent God allow the existence of evil and suffering in the world? This question is particularly problematic for monotheistic religions like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, where God is typically seen as omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and omnibenevolent, all-good. If God has the power to stop evil, the knowledge of evil, and the desire to prevent it, then why does evil persist? To approach this conundrum, we need to break it down and examine its core components. At the heart of the problem lies a logical contradiction. It seems impossible to reconcile the existence of a perfect God with the presence of evil. This is known as the logical problem of evil. The argument can be summarized as follows. 1. If God is omnipotent, then God has the power to prevent evil. 2. If God is omniscient, then God knows when evil is happening or will happen. 3. If God is omnibenevolent, then God would want to prevent all evil. 4. Evil exists. This formulation creates an apparent contradiction. If God truly possesses these three attributes, why does evil continue to exist in the world? Why is there suffering, pain, and injustice? One of the most common responses to the problem of evil is the free will defense. This argument posits that God gave human beings free will, the ability to make their own choices, independent of divine interference. Free will is often viewed as a greater good, something valuable that allows for genuine relationships, moral growth, and meaningful decision-making. However, the existence of free will also opens the door to the possibility of evil. When people make choices that harm others or the world around them, they exercise their free will in ways that lead to suffering. In this view, the presence of evil is not God's doing, but rather a necessary consequence of the gift of free will. For example, imagine a world where humans had no choice but to act in morally good ways, like robots following a pre-programmed set of instructions. Without the freedom to choose between right and wrong, our actions would lose their moral significance. The free will defense suggests that God permits evil because to do otherwise would mean taking away the meaningful freedom of choice. One analogy often used here is that of a parent and child. A parent may allow a child to make mistakes and face the consequences because that is how the child learns and grows. If the parent controlled every aspect of the child's life, never allowing any missteps, the child would never develop autonomy or moral understanding. While the free will defense addresses some concerns, it doesn't account for all types of evil, particularly natural evil. Events like earthquakes, hurricanes, and diseases that cause suffering but are not the direct result of human choices. Why would an all-good God allow such catastrophes to occur, causing immense suffering and death? This leads to the evidential problem of evil, which focuses not just on the existence of evil, but on the scale and apparent randomness of it. For instance, consider a natural disaster that kills thousands of innocent people. The magnitude of suffering seems disproportionate and often appears pointless. Couldn't God have created a world with less suffering? Couldn't natural disasters be less frequent, less severe, or even non-existent? Theologians and philosophers have offered several responses to this problem. One response is that natural evil provides opportunities for moral growth. For example, disasters often lead to acts of heroism, compassion, and selflessness. Without adversity, some argue, humanity would lack the opportunities for the development of virtues like courage, resilience, and empathy. Another perspective comes from the notion that we, as finite beings, cannot comprehend the full scope of God's plan. From our limited perspective, the existence of suffering may seem incomprehensible, but a divine being with a view of the entire universe and all of history might allow suffering for reasons that we cannot fathom. This is often referred to as skeptical theism, the idea that we should be skeptical of our ability to understand God's reasons for allowing evil. Another important response to the problem of evil is the soul-making theodicy developed by philosophers like John Hick. According to this view, the world serves as a place of soul-making, where individuals grow morally and spiritually through their experiences with suffering and evil. Hick argues that a world without challenges, pain, or moral conflict would not allow for the development of the virtues that make us fully human. Think of this like physical exercise. Just as our muscles grow stronger through resistance and effort, our moral character is said to develop through facing adversity. Without the challenges posed by a world that includes both good and evil, humans would remain morally immature, never developing qualities like compassion, forgiveness, or perseverance. The problem of evil remains one of the most difficult challenges in the philosophy of religion, while the free will defense, the soul-making theodicy, and other responses offer compelling explanations. None seem to fully resolve the tension between the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God and the pervasive presence of evil and suffering. At the end of the day, the problem of evil may point to the limits of human understanding. For some, it suggests that there are deep mysteries in the universe that we may never fully unravel. For others, it raises doubts about the existence or nature of God. But for many believers, it is a call to trust in a higher power, despite the presence of suffering, a trust that, while not providing clear answers, offers a sense of hope and meaning amid life's darkest moments. Eternal recurrence. Eternal recurrence is one of the most provocative and mysterious philosophical concepts introduced by Friedrich Nietzsche. At its core, it is the idea that the universe and all events within it are destined to repeat themselves infinitely, in a cycle that has no beginning or end. Everything that has happened, is happening, and will do so again, exactly the same way, over and over for eternity. The idea first appears in Nietzsche's works in The Gay Science, and later takes on a more prominent role in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But the concept is far more than a theoretical idea or metaphysical speculation for Nietzsche. It is a test of human existence itself, a thought experiment, designed to challenge us at the most existential level. Imagine that you are watching a movie, your favorite movie. You know all the scenes, the dialogue, the twists, and the ending. It's enjoyable, even comforting to revisit it from time to time. But now imagine being told that for the rest of eternity you will watch this same movie again and again with no escape. No new surprises, no alternate ending, just the same frames repeating forever. Would you still love the movie? Or would its endless repetition turn what was once joyful into something nightmarish? This is a metaphor for Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. Instead of a movie, it's your life, with all its triumphs and tragedies, joys and sorrows. Everything you've ever done, every choice you've ever made, whether right or wrong, will be lived out endlessly. And the real question that Nietzsche poses is, can you embrace this? Would you welcome this eternal repetition with joy, or would it fill you with dread? Nietzsche's eternal recurrence is not just a reflection on time, but a moral and existential challenge. He asks us to imagine living our lives, not as if we had endless chances to improve and correct, but as if every action we took would be relived over and over. Would we make the same choices? Would we change the way we live, knowing that every decision carries the weight of eternity? For Nietzsche, this thought experiment serves as a litmus test for authenticity. It forces us to ask ourselves whether we are truly living in a way that we would want to repeat forever. If the thought of eternal recurrence fills us with horror, then Nietzsche suggests we are not living authentically. We are not living in a way that affirms life with its full set of complexities, challenges, and imperfections. One of Nietzsche's responses to the eternal recurrence is the idea of amor fati, which translates to the love of fate. This is the attitude of embracing everything that happens in life, good and bad, as something not only to accept, but to love. For Nietzsche, to truly live well is to love life so much that you would gladly live it again and again for eternity. Amor fati is not a passive acceptance of whatever life throws at you. It is an active affirmation of everything that is. It's a philosophy of saying yes to life, not only to the moments of pleasure and happiness, but also to the suffering, struggles, and failures. Nietzsche believed that to truly embrace eternal recurrence, one must adopt this attitude of loving one's fate. Imagine, for instance, someone going through a difficult period of loss or hardship. If they could view this hardship not as something to be resented or escaped, but as a necessary and even beautiful part of the human experience, then they would be embodying the spirit of amor fati in a world where every event must recur eternally. The only way to live without despair is to embrace everything that happens to us as valuable and meaningful. In many ways, the concept of eternal recurrence challenges the traditional linear view of time that most of us take for granted. We tend to think of time as moving forward in a straight line, where each moment is unique, never to be repeated. Nietzsche's view, however, offers a radical alternative. Time is cyclical, where everything repeats itself eternally. This idea of cyclical time has echoes in ancient philosophy and mythologies, from the Hindu concept of samsara, the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, to the ancient Greeks, who believed in cycles of cosmic renewal. But Nietzsche's take is unique in that it is devoid of any divine purpose or spiritual progression. There is no final reward or ultimate meaning in the eternal recurrence. It is simply the eternal repetition of the same events, driven by the cold mechanics of the universe. For Nietzsche, this lack of cosmic purpose is precisely what makes life so precious and meaningful. If there is no final redemption, no divine plan, then every moment of life becomes infinitely valuable, because it is all we have. In this sense, eternal recurrence is a way of rejecting escapism, a belief that our lives are merely a prelude to some greater existence in the afterlife or the future. Nietzsche wants us to confront life as it is, in all its stark reality. Eternal recurrence is not merely an intellectual exercise for Nietzsche. It's an existential test. It asks, can you say yes to life as it is, with all its suffering and joy, knowing that you will relive it endlessly? Nietzsche believed that only the strongest individuals, what he referred to as the Übermensch or Overman, could fully embrace this idea. The Overman is someone who lives life with such intensity and authenticity that they would gladly accept eternal recurrence. For them, life is not something to escape or transcend, but something to affirm and celebrate, even in its most painful moments. To embrace eternal recurrence, then, is to embrace life with all its chaos and contradictions. It's to live in such a way that you would welcome the opportunity to live the exact same life again and again for all eternity. For Nietzsche, this is the ultimate test of one's strength and the highest expression of a life fully lived. Eternal recurrence, it is Nietzsche's challenge to us to live more fully, more deeply, and more authentically. It's a radical call to embrace everything in life, both the good and the bad, with open arms. If we can live in such a way that we would gladly live the same life over and over, then we have truly achieved a life worth living. In essence, eternal recurrence is less about metaphysical speculation and more about confronting the human condition. It forces us to ask the question, if my life were to repeat endlessly, would I be proud of the way I've lived? If the answer is no, then it serves as an invitation to change, to live in a way that affirms life, rather than rejects or escapes it. Moral relativism. Moral relativism is a philosophical concept that questions the universality of moral principles, asserting that what is considered right or wrong is not absolute, but is shaped by cultural, social, or individual contexts. Unlike moral absolutism, which posits that certain actions are universally right or wrong, regardless of circumstance, moral relativism suggests that morality is fluid, varying across societies, time periods, or even individual perspectives. Imagine two neighboring cultures living on separate islands. On one island, it's customary to honor the elderly by passing leadership and decision-making responsibilities to them, believing that wisdom comes with age. On the other island, youth is celebrated, and the young are encouraged to take charge, with the belief that fresh perspectives and energy are the key to progress. Now, suppose a person from the first island visits the second and finds their system of governance disrespectful to the elderly. Meanwhile, someone from the second island visiting the first finds their leadership system stifling and regressive. Both individuals view the other culture's practices as morally wrong, but from the perspective of the societies they belong to, both practices are considered morally right. This scenario captures the essence of moral relativism. Morality is not universal, but shaped by specific social, cultural, and historical circumstances. Cultural relativism, a branch of moral relativism, suggests that moral values and judgments are inherently tied to cultural norms and traditions. Anthropologists who study cultures often find that practices considered abhorrent or strange in one society may be viewed as virtuous or normal in another. Take, for instance, the practice of arranged marriage. In some cultures, it is seen as a practical, time-honored tradition that promotes familial harmony and stability. In others, it might be viewed as an infringement on individual autonomy and freedom. Cultural relativism asserts that neither perspective is objectively correct or incorrect. Rather, each moral judgment is shaped by cultural context. One common analogy used to explain this is language. Just as different societies have developed distinct languages, so too have they developed distinct moral codes. We wouldn't say that one language is inherently better than another. Each language serves its purpose in its cultural context. Similarly, according to cultural relativists, no moral system is inherently superior to another. Each is a reflection of the values and norms that develop in a specific culture. Going a step further from cultural relativism, individual relativism, also known as ethical subjectivism, holds that moral judgments are not just shaped by culture but by individual preferences and beliefs. What is right for one person may not be right for another, even within the same culture. Consider two individuals living in the same society, both encountering a moral dilemma, whether or not to tell a lie in a situation that could harm someone's feelings. One person believes honesty is the highest moral virtue, no matter the consequences. The other person believes kindness and avoiding harm are more important, even if it means being dishonest. From an individual relativist's perspective, both positions can be morally justified based on personal values. There is no objective truth about whether lying is morally right or wrong. It depends on each person's subjective perspective. This version of relativism can be more challenging because it implies that there is no overarching standard to which people can appeal when moral disagreements arise. If each person's moral code is equally valid, how do we resolve conflicts where two individuals hold opposing views on a particular issue? One of the most compelling strengths of moral relativism is its capacity to promote tolerance and understanding. By acknowledging that different societies or individuals may have valid, though divergent, moral frameworks, it encourages open-mindedness and discourages the imposition of one's own moral standards on others. In a world that is increasingly interconnected and diverse, moral relativism provides a framework for appreciating the complexities of human societies without rushing to judgment. For instance, when we encounter practices from other cultures that we find unsettling or immoral, such as certain rites of passage, dietary restrictions, or attitudes toward gender roles, moral relativism suggests that we take a step back and try to understand the historical, social, and cultural context that shaped those practices. However, moral relativism also faces significant criticisms. One major challenge is the issue of moral disagreements on critical human rights issues. If we accept that morality is entirely relative, how do we address practices that most people would agree are morally wrong, such as genocide, slavery, or systemic discrimination? Can we simply say that because these actions are accepted in certain cultural contexts, they are morally permissible? Critics argue that moral relativism can lead to a kind of moral paralysis, where we are unable to condemn atrocities or injustices because we are too focused on respecting cultural or individual differences. They point to the need for some form of moral universalism, principles that apply across cultures, like the idea that all people have a right to life, freedom, and dignity. In modern societies where globalization and cultural exchange are constant, moral relativism presents both a challenge and an opportunity. On the one hand, it asks us to consider the diversity of moral perspectives and to refrain from imposing our own values on others. On the other hand, it forces us to grapple with the question of whether there are some moral principles that should be upheld universally. A practical example of this tension can be seen in international human rights debates, when cultural practices such as child marriage, female genital mutilation, or religiously motivated punishment are brought to light. Moral relativism reminds us that these practices may be deeply rooted in cultural traditions. Yet, many argue that there are universal human rights that should override cultural practices when they harm individuals or limit their freedom. Moral relativism offers a nuanced view of ethics that recognizes the diversity of human experience. It asks us to approach morality with humility, acknowledging that what we view as morally right or wrong is often shaped by factors beyond our control, our culture, upbringing, and personal experiences. However, navigating the tension between tolerance and moral responsibility is the real challenge of moral relativism. While it encourages an open-minded approach to understanding different perspectives, it also forces us to consider when, if ever, we are justified in calling for moral change in others. In this way, moral relativism remains a vital, though complex framework for understanding the evolving moral landscape of our interconnected world. The uncanny. The uncanny is a concept deeply intertwined with our psychological experience of the familiar becoming unsettling. Coined by Sigmund Freud in his 1919 essay, Das Unheimliche, the uncanny, from the German word unheimlich meaning unhomely or unfamiliar, describes something that is both strange and eerily familiar at the same time. The uncanny makes us feel disturbed because it takes something we recognize and twists it into something disconcerting. This feeling arises when the familiar, instead of providing comfort, triggers confusion and dread. To understand the uncanny, consider an example from everyday life. Imagine walking through a childhood home that has been vacant for years. The walls, the furniture, even the light fixtures are exactly how you remember them. But something feels off. The once familiar space no longer feels safe or welcoming. It feels alien. as though you've stepped into a parallel version of your own memories. This dissonance, where the familiar becomes unfamiliar, is the essence of the uncanny. It's not just spaces that can evoke this feeling. Another classic example is seeing a lifelike humanoid figure, such as a mannequin or a hyper-realistic robot. The human brain, finely tuned to recognize faces and bodies, picks up on the artificiality. And this discrepancy between what looks human and what feels non-human unsettles it. This is what's often referred to as the uncanny valley in robotics and animation. When something appears almost human but not quite, it creates a sense of eerie unease. Freud's interpretation of the uncanny is tied to repressed emotions and memories. According to Freud, when something repressed from our unconscious mind resurfaces, it manifests as a distorted, unsettling version of the familiar. In his essay, Freud analyzes E.T.A. Hoffmann's story, The Sandman, in which a lifelike doll evokes feelings of terror in the protagonist. Freud suggests that the doll represents something that has been repressed, perhaps the fear of losing one's sense of identity or control. And when this repressed fear emerges, it comes through in an uncanny, distorted way. For Freud, the uncanny is not just about external objects or settings, but about our inner psyche. It's the moment when what we've tried to bury deep in our unconscious, the thoughts, desires, or fears we refuse to acknowledge, resurfaces and disrupts our sense of reality. The uncanny has long been a powerful theme in art, literature, and film, where creators exploit this feeling to provoke discomfort and reflection. Consider the paintings of René Magritte, particularly works like The Lovers, 1928, where two people kiss, but their faces are obscured by cloth. The image presents a familiar act, two people in an intimate moment, but the facelessness of the figures makes the scene feel bizarre and alien. The uncanny, in this case, challenges our expectations of normalcy, reminding us that beneath the surface of the familiar, there can be hidden layers of strangeness. In literature, writers like Edgar Allan Poe masterfully evoke the uncanny in stories where the boundaries between the known and unknown blur. In Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, the atmosphere of decay and the strange relationship between the Usher siblings create an overwhelming sense of unease. The house itself, an object once associated with safety and stability, becomes an extension of the psychological unraveling of its inhabitants. Again, the uncanny emerges when what should be stable and comforting becomes threatening and alien. The uncanny has taken on new dimensions in the digital age, particularly with advances in artificial intelligence and robotics. As machines become increasingly human-like, the line between human and artificial blurs, and this ambiguity can evoke uncanny feelings. Take the development of AI-generated avatars or deep-fake technology, for example. These creations can mimic human expressions and speech patterns so convincingly that they challenge our ability to distinguish between what is real and what is artificial. While these technologies are impressive, they also stir a deep-seated discomfort. When we encounter an AI that looks and sounds almost human but doesn't quite cross the threshold into true human behavior, we are thrown into an uncanny valley where our brains struggle to reconcile the real with the imitation. Another key aspect of the uncanny is the concept of the double, which Freud also discusses in his analysis. The double is a mirror image or doppelganger, and encountering one's double in literature or folklore often signals a breakdown in identity or reality. This phenomenon has fascinated humans for centuries, appearing in myths, legends, and horror stories. When we see ourselves reflected back through a distorted lens, it can evoke a profound sense of unease, because it challenges our understanding of individuality and personal identity. One powerful cultural manifestation of this is in the realm of horror, where characters encounter versions of themselves that embody their worst fears or suppressed desires. Think of films like Black Swan or Us, where the protagonists confront versions of themselves that are both familiar and terrifying. The double in these stories symbolizes a loss of control over one's own identity, a key trigger of the uncanny. Why does the uncanny affect us so deeply? At its core, the uncanny reflects the fragile boundaries between the known and the unknown, between what we understand and what we can't quite grasp. It reminds us that reality is not as stable or coherent as we might like to believe. Whether it's encountering a lifelike robot, an eerily familiar setting, or even our own reflections, the uncanny forces us to confront the strangeness lurking within the familiar. In this way, the uncanny also offers a profound insight into human psychology. It reveals our discomfort with ambiguity, our need for clear boundaries between self and other, human and machine, real and unreal. The uncanny challenges these boundaries, pushing us to reconsider what we know and what we fear about the unknown. The uncanny is ultimately a mirror that reflects not just the world around us, but also the complexities of our own minds. By unsettling our expectations and blurring the lines between familiar and strange, it opens a window into the deepest, most hidden aspects of human experience. Antinatalism. Antinatalism is a philosophical position that argues against procreation, suggesting that bringing new life into existence is inherently harmful. This perspective stands in stark contrast to the prevailing view that life as a gift is something valuable and worth creating. Antinatalism challenges our deepest assumptions about life's worth, posing questions about the ethics of birth, suffering, and responsibility. One of the most well-known advocates of antinatalism is contemporary philosopher David Benatar, but its roots stretch back centuries, influencing thinkers across various philosophical traditions. At the heart of antinatalism lies a provocative question: is life itself inherently harmful? The argument begins by observing that life, for all its joys, inevitably contains suffering. Every living being will experience pain, loss, illness, and ultimately death. For some, these hardships may be severe. For others, they might be mild, but suffering is universal. In light of this, antinatalists argue that bringing someone into existence guarantees they will suffer, making birth an ethically questionable act. David Benatar, in his book Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, articulates what is perhaps the most sophisticated argument for antinatalism. His position is built on an asymmetry between pleasure and pain. According to Benatar, the absence of pain is good, even if no one exists to experience it, but the absence of pleasure is not bad, unless there is someone who misses it. In other words, if a person is never born, they are spared all suffering, and do not miss out on any pleasures, since they don't exist to feel deprivation. Thus, Benatar concludes that not being born is preferable to existence. To grasp antinatalism, it's crucial to explore the role of suffering. Life is full of pleasures and joys, but it is also punctuated by suffering, ranging from minor discomforts to extreme pain. For antinatalists, the ethical question centers on the inevitability of suffering in any life. No matter how fortunate or happy a person's life is, they will experience some form of suffering, whether physical, emotional, or psychological. Consider the analogy of a lottery ticket. Giving birth is like forcing someone to play a lottery where the worst outcomes are certain suffering and eventual death. Even though there are positive experiences, like winning small prizes, the fact that you cannot opt out of the ticket means you are forced to endure whatever hardships life brings. In this analogy, antinatalists argue that it's better not to hand out lottery tickets at all. One of the central ethical concerns in antinatalism is the issue of consent. When someone decides to have a child, they are making a choice on behalf of another being, someone who does not yet exist, and therefore cannot consent to the life they are about to receive. This act of imposing life without consent raises moral questions. In essence, antinatalists argue that by bringing a child into existence, parents are subjecting them to a lifetime of potential suffering without their agreement or foreknowledge. This issue of consent is particularly troubling from an antinatalist viewpoint, because once a person is born, they are locked into life with all its trials and tribulations. They cannot undo their existence or go back to a state of non-being, making it a one-way decision with profound and irreversible consequences. While Benatar's modern formulation is influential, the idea that life may not be worth living is not new. In ancient philosophy, the pessimistic tradition can be traced back to the works of Greek tragedians like Sophocles, who famously wrote in Oedipus at Colonus that not to be born is, beyond all estimation, best. The sentiment that life may be more suffering than joy is also found in the teachings of Buddhism, where life is often viewed as a cycle of suffering from which the ultimate goal is to escape through enlightenment and the cessation of rebirth. Similarly, philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, a 19th century German thinker, was a noted pessimist who believed that life is dominated by suffering, driven by insatiable desires and needs that can never be fully satisfied. Schopenhauer's work profoundly influenced later existentialist and pessimistic thinkers, and his ideas about the futility of existence laid much of the groundwork for the antinatalist position. While antinatalism raises unsettling questions, it is not without its critics. Some argue that life's pleasures and potential for happiness outweigh the inevitable suffering. From this perspective, suffering is part of a broader, richer experience that includes love, joy, creativity, and fulfillment. Many people believe that life's value cannot be reduced to a simple calculus of pleasure and pain. Others challenge antinatalism by pointing out that life, even with its suffering, offers opportunities for meaning and purpose. Existentialist thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Viktor Frankl argue that humans are capable of creating meaning in life, even in the face of suffering. In this view, life's challenges are not reasons to avoid birth, but invitations to engage with existence in a more profound way. Another counterpoint is that suffering, while real, can often lead to growth, resilience, and empathy. The hardships of life may teach us to cope, adapt, and help others, leading to a fuller, more compassionate experience of existence. Antinatalism forces us to confront an uncomfortable ethical dilemma. Is it better to avoid existence altogether, thereby sparing potential beings from suffering, or to embrace life's complexity with all its joy and pain as something inherently valuable? For antinatalists, the answer leans towards the former, but for many, the question is not so simple. The idea of a world without new life is difficult to accept, because it touches on our deepest instincts and cultural values about family, continuity, and the future. Ultimately, antinatalism is a call to think critically about the ethics of birth, responsibility, and the potential harms of existence. Whether or not one agrees with its conclusions, it challenges us to reflect on the often unexamined assumption that life is inherently good, and that procreation is a moral good. It brings into focus the weighty decision involved in bringing new life into a world filled with both suffering and beauty. Paradox of tragedy. The paradox of tragedy is a philosophical concept that grapples with a strange and seemingly contradictory aspect of human experience. Why do we find pleasure in tragic art, even though it depicts suffering, pain, and misfortune? From the ancient tragedies of Sophocles to the melancholic films of today, humans have long been drawn to stories that evoke sadness and despair. Yet, paradoxically, these experiences often leave us feeling enriched, moved, or even uplifted. Why do we seek out sorrow in art? And how can this emotional response be reconciled with the natural human desire to avoid pain? On the surface, it seems that experiencing or witnessing suffering is something to be avoided. In our daily lives, we steer away from pain, misfortune, and emotional distress. We don't enjoy the anguish of real-life tragedies, the loss of loved ones, wars, or natural disasters. But in a theater or while reading a novel, we actively seek them out. Aristotle, in his Poetics, was one of the earliest thinkers to explore this issue. He suggested that tragic drama provides a kind of emotional cleansing or catharsis. Through tragedy, audiences experience a purging of negative emotions, pity and fear, by watching the suffering of the characters unfold on stage. Yet the paradox remains. If we naturally avoid pain in real life, why do we voluntarily subject ourselves to it in art? This contradiction is at the heart of the paradox of tragedy. While Aristotle's theory of catharsis offers a compelling answer, the topic has been revisited many times throughout the history of philosophy, each time revealing new dimensions of the puzzle. One possible explanation for the appeal of tragedy lies in the human capacity for empathy. When we watch a tragic play, read a heart-wrenching novel, or listen to a sorrowful symphony, we are not merely passive observers. We are active participants in the emotional landscape of the narrative, allowing ourselves to feel the sorrow, pain, and loss that the characters experience. But unlike real-life suffering, where we might feel powerless or overwhelmed, tragic art provides a safe space to confront these emotions. Imagine watching a Shakespearean tragedy like King Lear. The play tells the story of a father's descent into madness after being betrayed by his daughters. His suffering is palpable, and as an audience member, you might feel the weight of his anguish. Yet, unlike real-life tragedy, you know that this story is contained. You aren't personally responsible for Lear's suffering, and you are free to leave the theater at any time. This detachment creates a balance between immersion in the narrative and emotional safety, allowing you to explore intense feelings without the same personal stakes as real-life tragedy. In this way, tragedy becomes a mirror of human experience. It reflects the universal emotions of loss, grief, and despair that are part of life. But it does so in a way that lets us process these feelings with a degree of control and distance. Through this process, we may come to understand our own emotions better, feel more connected to others, or gain insight into the fragility of human existence. Another explanation for the paradox comes from what is known as aesthetic distance. This concept refers to the psychological separation between the audience and the work of art. While we empathize with the characters in a tragedy, we also remain aware that we are engaging with a fictional or artistic representation. This awareness allows us to appreciate the beauty of the art itself, the language, the structure, the performances, without being overwhelmed by the sorrow or pain depicted. Consider an opera like Verdi's La Traviata, in which the heroine, Violetta, dies a slow and painful death from illness. While the subject matter is tragic, the music that accompanies it is sublime. The beauty of Verdi's composition transforms the sorrow into something transcendent, giving us a kind of pleasure that is not directly tied to the suffering itself, but to the way the suffering is expressed. The emotional intensity of the tragedy, when paired with the aesthetic beauty of the performance, creates a complex emotional response that is both painful and pleasurable. Some philosophers suggest that our attraction to tragedy stems from the human need to make sense of suffering. In life, suffering often seems random, meaningless, and unfair. Tragic art, however, tends to impose structure and meaning onto suffering. In a tragedy, the characters' fates are tied to larger themes of justice, fate, or moral consequence. Their suffering is not random, but part of a coherent narrative. This sense of order gives us the opportunity to confront the darker aspects of existence in a way that feels purposeful. Take, for instance, the Greek tragedies of Aeschylus, such as the Orestia. These plays explore themes of vengeance, justice, and the will of the gods. The characters endure great suffering, but their suffering is part of a larger moral framework. Watching these tragedies unfold can offer a kind of solace, as they suggest that even the darkest moments of human life may have meaning or purpose. In real life, we may struggle to find meaning in our own suffering, but in the world of tragic art, suffering is part of a grand, intelligible design. In many ways, tragedy mirrors the human journey through suffering, loss, and ultimately redemption. By engaging with tragic art, we are taken on an emotional journey that mirrors the human condition. Tragic art gives us a way to confront difficult emotions, find meaning in suffering, and appreciate the complexity of life. The paradox of tragedy, then, is not just about why we find pleasure in sadness, but about the role that tragedy plays in helping us navigate the darkest corners of human experience. In conclusion, the paradox of tragedy is a rich and complex philosophical puzzle that taps into deep emotional, aesthetic, and psychological aspects of the human condition. Whether through catharsis, empathy, or the search for meaning, tragic art continues to captivate us, offering a space where we can explore the profound, often painful realities of life with a sense of detachment, beauty, and, ultimately, understanding. The danger of knowledge. Knowledge has long been revered as humanity's greatest tool. From the Promethean myth of stealing fire from the gods to the Enlightenment's belief in reason, knowledge has been seen as a path to progress, freedom, and power. But beneath this idealistic view, there's a darker, more ominous side to the pursuit of knowledge, a side that many philosophers, scientists, and writers have warned us about for centuries. This is the paradoxical notion that knowledge, when pursued without limits or ethical consideration, can be dangerous, destabilizing, and even destructive. One of the earliest and most powerful examples of the dangers of knowledge comes from ancient Greek mythology in the story of Prometheus. Prometheus, a titan, defies Zeus by stealing fire from the gods and gifting it to humanity. Fire, in this context, is not merely a tool for warmth and cooking, but a symbol of knowledge and technology. With fire, humanity gains power over the natural world and the ability to shape its own destiny. However, the myth doesn't celebrate Prometheus's act as purely heroic. Zeus punishes him severely, chaining him to a rock where an eagle eats his liver every day. The myth underscores that there are consequences to overreaching, to tampering with forces beyond our understanding or control. In many ways, this myth is echoed in modern scientific dilemmas, from nuclear power to artificial intelligence. In the modern world, scientific knowledge has allowed us to build incredible technologies, cure diseases, and extend human lifespans. But for every advancement, there's a corresponding risk. Nuclear physics, for example, gave us the ability to unlock the power of the atom, which led to both the creation of clean energy and the development of atomic bombs. The same knowledge that allows us to power cities also gave us the capacity for mass destruction. This is the dual nature of knowledge. It's a tool that can be used for creation or destruction, depending on the hands that wield it. In the field of biology, the mapping of the human genome and advances in genetic engineering promise to revolutionize medicine. However, they also raise profound ethical questions. Should we genetically modify future generations? If we have the knowledge to alter the course of evolution, where do we draw the line? Could such power lead to unforeseen consequences, not just for individuals, but for society at large? This brings us to a broader philosophical question. Is there a limit to what we should know? At what point does the pursuit of knowledge become reckless? Sophocles' Oedipus Rex offers another classic warning about the dangers of knowledge. Oedipus, in his quest for truth, uncovers that he has unknowingly killed his father and married his mother, fulfilling a tragic prophecy. His pursuit of knowledge leads not to liberation, but to his own downfall. The play suggests that some truths, once discovered, cannot be undone, and that the human drive to know can sometimes lead us into places where we are better off in ignorance. This theme resonates in many areas of life. Consider how personal knowledge, knowing certain truths about loved ones, for instance, can sometimes cause more pain than comfort. While we often believe that knowledge will set us free, it can also imprison us in harsh realities we aren't prepared to face. In our increasingly digital world, the question of the dangers of knowledge becomes even more pressing. With the rise of artificial intelligence, AI, and data science, we are beginning to unlock massive amounts of information about the world and about each other. On the surface, this knowledge promises efficiency, convenience, and perhaps even a higher quality of life. But it also comes with significant risks. One major concern is privacy. With companies and governments collecting vast amounts of data on individuals, there is potential for misuse. What happens when knowledge about our habits, preferences, and even thoughts becomes a commodity? This surveillance society, fueled by the pursuit of knowledge, might infringe on basic freedoms and autonomy. Similarly, AI, with its capacity to learn and evolve, raises the specter of machines surpassing human intelligence, a scenario that has been warned about in both philosophical debates and science fiction for decades. Immanuel Kant, one of the most influential philosophers of the Enlightenment, was deeply concerned with the limitations of human knowledge. In his critique of pure reason, Kant argued that while we can know the world as it appears to us, the phenomenal world, we cannot access the world as it is in itself, the noumenal world. There are limits to what human reason and perception can grasp. In a way, Kant offers a warning against the hubris of assuming that we can know everything. There are realms of reality, perhaps even vital ones, that remain forever beyond our grasp. By accepting the limits of knowledge, Kant suggests, we avoid the pitfalls of overreaching and the dangers of assuming that all mysteries can be solved. The pursuit of knowledge is deeply embedded in human nature. We are creatures of curiosity, always seeking to understand more about the world and our place in it. But as history, philosophy, and myth all remind us, knowledge is not neutral. It is a force that must be wielded carefully. Whether it's the scientist in the lab, the philosopher in the library, or the individual navigating their personal life, the pursuit of knowledge carries profound responsibilities. We must always ask ourselves not just what we can know, but what we should know, and at what cost. The simulation hypothesis. Imagine for a moment that everything around you, the sounds, the sights, the sensations, are not the physical manifestations of an external reality, but the meticulously crafted outputs of a computer program. This might sound like the plot of a science fiction film, but it's the core idea behind the simulation hypothesis, a theory suggesting that our entire universe could be an advanced digital simulation run by a superintelligent civilization. While it may seem far-fetched, this hypothesis has gained serious traction in philosophical and scientific circles, with thinkers like Nick Bostrom and even tech leaders like Elon Musk weighing in on its plausibility. The argument for the simulation hypothesis is based on probability. Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom popularized the idea in his 2003 paper, Are You Living in a Computer Simulation? Bostrom proposed that at least one of three possibilities must be true. 1. All human civilizations at our level of technological development go extinct before becoming capable of creating simulations of conscious being. 2. If such civilizations do reach that stage, they are unlikely to run many simulations for moral or ethical reasons. 3. We are almost certainly living in a computer simulation. Bostrom's argument hinges on the assumption that if we, or any civilization, were to reach a point where creating simulations of conscious beings is possible, it's likely that many such simulations would be created. If millions or even billions of simulations were run, the odds of any one individual being part of the original universe, rather than a simulated one, become astronomically small. We could very well be digital beings, unknowingly living in a virtual environment. One way to understand this hypothesis is to look at the rapid development of video games. In the 1970s, video games like Pong were nothing more than a few moving pixels on a screen. Fast forward to today, and games like Red Dead Redemption 2 or Cyberpunk 2077 are incredibly detailed, immersive worlds, populated with lifelike characters and vast landscapes. Now, imagine projecting this technological advancement forward 1,000 years, or even 1,000,000. If computing power continues to grow, it's not inconceivable that future simulations could become so advanced that they are indistinguishable from reality. The characters in these games wouldn't know they were part of a simulation. They would have consciousness, emotions, and experiences, all crafted by code, but entirely real to them. In this context, the simulation hypothesis suggests that we are like those characters. Our world, too, could be the creation of some advanced intelligence far beyond our understanding. The idea that reality may not be what it seems is not a new one. In fact, it stretches back to ancient philosophy. One of the most famous examples is Plato's allegory of the cave. In this allegory, prisoners are chained inside a cave, able only to see shadows on the wall cast by objects behind them. These shadows are their entire reality. They have no idea that a whole world exists outside the cave until one prisoner is freed and realizes the truth. In many ways, the simulation hypothesis is a modern version of Plato's cave. We are the prisoners, perceiving only what the simulation allows us to see. The outside world could be the realm of the simulators, completely hidden from us, just as the freed prisoner in Plato's stories struggles to comprehend the real world. After seeing only shadows, we might struggle to grasp the reality beyond the simulation, if such a reality exists at all. While the simulation hypothesis remains a philosophical speculation, some scientists point to certain peculiarities in physics as potential evidence. One such anomaly involves the nature of the universe at the quantum level. The pixelation in video games, where objects are made up of discrete units, can be loosely compared to the quantization we see in nature. Quantum mechanics tells us that energy and matter aren't continuous, but come in discrete packets, much like pixels in a digital environment. Could this be a clue that our universe operates like a programmed simulation? Additionally, the speed of light acts as a sort of universal speed limit, which could be interpreted as a hardware limitation in a simulation. In video games, the processing power of the computer running the game determines how fast things can move and react. Is the speed of light a similar cap imposed by the computational resources of the system simulating our universe? If we are living in a simulation, what does that mean for our understanding of existence, ethics, and purpose? For one, the simulation hypothesis challenges traditional concepts of free will. If our actions are predetermined by the simulation's programming, can we really claim to have agency over our choices? Are our lives just scripts running according to a pre-written code? There's also the question of responsibility. If there are creators, simulators, are they responsible for the suffering in the world? Would it be ethical for a superior civilization to create simulations that contain pain, war, and inequality? Or are these just byproducts of the simulated universe, similar to how characters in video games experience hardship for the sake of a more immersive narrative? On the flip side, the simulation hypothesis can also offer a strange sense of comfort. If we are living in a simulation, it means that death might not be the end. Just as characters in video games can be restarted or reprogrammed, it's possible that our consciousnesses could be reloaded in another simulation, suggesting a form of digital immortality. While the simulation hypothesis is intriguing, it's important to recognize that it remains speculative. There's currently no direct evidence to prove we're living in a simulation, and the hypothesis raises more questions than it answers. However, as technology advances and our understanding of consciousness and reality deepens, this philosophical idea may one day shift into the realm of testable scientific theory. Whether or not we're living in a simulation, the hypothesis forces us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and our place in the cosmos. It challenges us to think beyond our immediate perceptions and to consider possibilities that stretch the limits of human imagination. And in that sense, it may not matter whether the theory is true or false. What matters is the journey it takes us on in exploring the unknown, the will to power. Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the will to power is one of his most profound and controversial ideas. Often misunderstood or oversimplified, it serves as a central theme in his philosophical work, representing much more than just a crude desire for dominance or control. At its heart, Nietzsche's will to power is an exploration of the driving force behind human behavior, the evolution of life, and the very fabric of existence itself. To grasp the essence of the will to power, it helps to consider it as the energy or dynamism inherent in all things, both living and non-living. Nietzsche believed that every aspect of reality, from the actions of individual humans to the fundamental processes of nature, could be understood as manifestations of this underlying force. But this power isn't just about political or physical control. It's about growth, creativity, self-overcoming, and the continual striving for excellence and self-expression. Traditional philosophical frameworks often describe the primary instinct of life as the will to survive. That is, creatures act primarily to preserve their lives, avoid danger, and pass on their genes. Nietzsche found this explanation too limiting. For him, life was not merely a struggle for survival, but something more dynamic and vibrant. Organisms, he argued, don't just seek to avoid death. They strive to expand their influence, to grow, to exert their creative power on the world around them. To illustrate this, consider the growth of a tree. A tree does not just exist to survive. It stretches its branches toward the sky, competing for sunlight with neighboring trees. Its roots burrow deep into the earth, not only to sustain itself, but to claim space, pushing out other plants. The tree, in its quiet way, expresses a will to power. It grows, it thrives, it seeks more than mere existence. Similarly, human beings, from the moment we are born, reach out into the world, not content to simply live, but to shape, build, and transform our environment in pursuit of something greater. Nietzsche saw this principle at play in all human ambition. Whether we are driven to succeed in business, art, or personal relationships, it is the will to power that propels us forward. This desire isn't limited to the desire for material wealth or social status. It also manifests in our quest for knowledge, understanding, and self-improvement. The scientist, in her relentless pursuit of discovery, seeks to impose order on chaos, to grasp the mysteries of the universe. The artist, in his creation of new works, expresses his inner vision, seeking to shape the world in a way that reflects his own power of imagination. Importantly, Nietzsche's will to power is not simply a selfish or destructive urge. It can be expressed in myriad ways, both constructive and transformative. Some people express their will to power through intellectual pursuits, others through physical feats or artistic endeavors. In each case, there is a striving to become more than what one currently is, to transcend limitations, to assert oneself in the world, not necessarily by dominating others, but by realizing one's own potential. One of the most profound aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy is the notion of self-overcoming. In contrast to a simplistic understanding of power as control over others, Nietzsche places greater emphasis on gaining mastery over oneself. This involves conquering one's fears, doubts, and limitations, constantly pushing beyond what one currently is to become something greater. Consider the example of an athlete training for the Olympics. To succeed, they must not only compete with others, but more importantly, with their own limits. Each day, they push their body and mind to new heights, overcoming exhaustion, pain, and self-doubt. For Nietzsche, this striving for personal excellence is a prime example of the will to power. It's a process of continual transformation and self-mastery, where the individual seeks to assert control over their own potential. In this sense, Nietzsche's will to power is closely connected to his concept of the Übermensch, often translated as Overman or Superman. The Übermensch is not a tyrant or oppressor, but a person who has achieved mastery over their own life, who lives according to their own values and continually seeks to transcend the ordinary. The will to power, then, is the force that drives individuals to evolve beyond their current state, both morally and creatively, in the pursuit of greatness. One of the most controversial aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy is how it challenges traditional notions of morality. For Nietzsche, the will to power transcends the binary of good and evil. He argues that conventional morality, particularly the morality rooted in Christian ethics, suppresses the will to power by encouraging meekness, submission, and self-denial. Nietzsche called this the slave morality, which he believed promoted weakness and inhibited human flourishing. In contrast, Nietzsche praised what he called master morality, which celebrates strength, creativity, and self-assertion. While master morality has been wrongly interpreted as advocating for ruthless domination over others, Nietzsche's point was more subtle. True power comes from the expression of one's own creative potential, not from subjugating others. Think of a brilliant entrepreneur or artist who achieves success by breaking free from conventional norms. They don't necessarily crush their competition. Instead, they create something so innovative and powerful that it redefines the landscape. This, for Nietzsche, is the highest expression of the will to power, not a force of destruction, but of creation. The concept of the will to power has often been misused or misunderstood, particularly in political contexts. Nietzsche's philosophy has sometimes been wrongly associated with totalitarian ideologies or brute force, but this is a grave oversimplification. While Nietzsche admired strength and individualism, He did not advocate for violence or the oppression of others. His will to power is ultimately about creation, self-overcoming, and the continuous transformation of life and values. In the end, Nietzsche's idea of the will to power is both a challenge and an invitation. It challenges us to rethink our understanding of power, success, and morality, while inviting us to embrace our potential for growth and transformation. It asks us to reject complacency, to confront our fears and limitations, and to assert our unique creative energies in a world that constantly demands more from us. Despair and existential crisis. Despair and existential crisis are concepts that have permeated the human experience for centuries, particularly in the realm of philosophy. While many people might associate these terms with extreme moments of sorrow or confusion, in philosophy, they represent something much deeper, a confrontation with the fundamental nature of existence itself. At the heart of an existential crisis is the question, what is the meaning of life? And often it's the unsettling realization that life may not have an inherent or predefined meaning that triggers this crisis. Imagine for a moment a person going about their daily life, absorbed in routines, relationships, and ambitions. Everything seems to have a purpose, whether it's the pursuit of a career, building a family, or simply enjoying leisure activities. But suddenly something disrupts this flow. A moment of profound doubt creeps in. The person begins to question why they are doing what they are doing. What is all this for? Why should they continue pursuing goals when, in the grand scheme of things, everything seems temporary and possibly insignificant? This moment of doubt is where existential crisis begins. It's a confrontation with the absurd nature of existence, where the individual realizes that all the things they've attached meaning to might be nothing more than arbitrary constructs, devoid of any cosmic or ultimate significance. This feeling is what many existential philosophers like Soren Kierkegaard and Jean-Paul Sartre wrestled with. Despair, in this sense, isn't merely sadness, but a deep form of existential anxiety, a collapse of the individual's sense of purpose. One of the earliest philosophers to explore despair in great detail was the Danish thinker Soren Kierkegaard. For Kierkegaard, despair was not just a passing emotional state, but rather a fundamental part of the human condition. In his view, despair arises from the individual's recognition of their own limitations and their inability to reconcile themselves with the infinite possibilities of life. Kierkegaard described different levels of despair, with the deepest being the despair of not willing to be oneself. This is when a person is so disconnected from their own potential and possibilities that they cannot bear to confront their own existence. In this state, they may feel trapped in their circumstances, unable to see a way forward. However, for Kierkegaard, despair is not a terminal condition. He believed that the only way out of despair is through what he called a leap of faith. This leap doesn't involve reason or rational justification. It's a leap into belief in something greater, often associated with religious faith. While Kierkegaard's solution is deeply theological, his diagnosis of despair has secular relevance. Despair forces individuals to confront the fact that no external system of meaning, be it religion, culture, or society, can provide them with a true sense of purpose. They must find or create meaning for themselves. In contrast to Kierkegaard, Jean-Paul Sartre's existential philosophy takes a more atheistic approach to despair and existential crisis. For Sartre, the root of despair lies not in the individual's limitations, but in their radical freedom. Sartre famously declared that existence precedes essence, meaning that human beings are not born with a predefined purpose or essence. Instead, we are thrust into the world, and it is up to us to define ourselves through our actions and choices. This freedom, however, comes with a heavy burden. If there is no inherent meaning to life, then we bear the full responsibility for creating our own meaning. This responsibility can be overwhelming and leads to what Sartre called anguish. Anguish is the recognition that in every moment we are choosing not just for ourselves, but in some sense for all of humanity. Every decision we make reflects a certain vision of what life should be, and this weight can feel unbearable. Sartre's existential crisis is not about a lack of freedom, but the terrifying abundance of it. Without any external guideposts, no divine authority, no universal moral laws, individuals are left to navigate their own path, and in doing so, they confront the absurdity of existence. Yet Sartre insists that this realization, while disorienting, can also be liberating. The individual, once freed from the illusion of a predetermined essence, can embrace their freedom and take ownership of their life. Albert Camus, another existentialist, described this confrontation with the meaninglessness of life as the absurd for Camus. The absurd arises from the conflict between human beings' desire for meaning and the silent, indifferent universe. While Kierkegaard sought salvation through faith and Sartre through existential freedom, Camus took a different approach. In the myth of Sisyphus, he famously likened human existence to the plight of Sisyphus, the figure from Greek mythology condemned to push a boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll back down, repeating this futile task for eternity. Camus argued that the recognition of life's absurdity doesn't necessarily lead to despair. Instead, it can inspire a form of defiance. Knowing that life has no inherent meaning, the individual is free to create their own meaning in the face of absurdity. Camus called this attitude revolt, a rejection of nihilism, not through false hope or resignation, but through a courageous acceptance of life's limitations and a commitment to live fully despite them. In this way, despair and existential crisis can be seen as turning points rather than dead ends. They are opportunities for individuals to confront the absurd, acknowledge the limitations of existence, and in doing so, carve out their own path. While existential philosophers offer different routes out of despair, be it Kierkegaard's leap of faith, Sartre's embrace of freedom, or Camus's revolt, what unites them is the idea that despair is a natural and necessary part of the human experience. It forces us to ask the most fundamental questions about who we are and what we want from life. In everyday terms, people encounter existential crises when they experience major life transitions, whether it's the loss of a job, a relationship, or even the simple process of aging. These moments of disruption force individuals to reevaluate their sense of self and their place in the world. Rather than viewing despair as something to be avoided, we might see it as a sign that we are grappling with the deepest and most important questions of existence. In confronting despair, we may find that while life offers no easy answers, it also presents endless possibilities. Despair, then, is not an end point, but the beginning of a journey towards self-understanding and personal meaning. Sisyphus and meaninglessness. The myth of Sisyphus is one of the most iconic symbols of human struggle in philosophy, especially when contemplating life's meaning, or lack thereof. In Greek mythology, Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll back down every time he neared the top. This punishment was to be endured for eternity, an endless cycle of effort that would never culminate in success or satisfaction. At first glance, this fate seems to embody the ultimate absurdity, a life of perpetual toil without any reward or resolution. But French philosopher Albert Camus saw something far deeper in the myth. Rather than just a tale of eternal suffering, he used it as an allegory for the human condition and the search for meaning in a universe that offers none. Camus coined the term the absurd to describe the conflict between humans' desire for meaning and the universe's indifference. We crave purpose, structure, and narrative in our lives, but the world, according to Camus, remains silent. There's no cosmic plan, no grand design to our existence. In this sense, Sisyphus becomes a symbol for the human condition, constantly striving, pushing forward, yet confronted by the futility of ever achieving lasting significance. In everyday life, many of us experience moments that echo the plight of Sisyphus. Think about how we build careers, nurture relationships, or pursue personal ambitions, only to encounter setbacks, failure, or the realization that our goals may not have the significance we once thought they did. Whether it's a mundane task like filing paperwork, or a deeper life endeavor like seeking personal fulfillment, there's often a gnawing sense that once we reach what we thought was our destination, we'll just have to start again. This repetitive cycle is at the heart of Camus's vision of the absurd. So, how does one live in a world that offers no inherent meaning? According to Camus, there are three possible responses to this realization: denial, suicide, or revolt. Denial would involve turning to external sources for meaning, such as religion or ideology, to impose a comforting framework on life. Camus rejects this approach, considering it a form of intellectual dishonesty. It's a refusal to confront the truth of life's inherent meaninglessness. The second response, suicide, is the literal escape from the absurd. For Camus, this is also a rejection of life itself. If life has no meaning, one might think, why not simply opt out? But Camus argues that this too is an avoidance of the absurd, rather than an engagement with it. The third response, and the one Camus advocates, is revolt. By revolt, he doesn't mean political revolution, but an internal defiance. In the face of absurdity, we must accept life's lack of meaning and continue living anyway. This revolt isn't about finding some hidden meaning in the struggle. Rather, it's about embracing the struggle itself. In this way, Sisyphus becomes a hero in Camus' philosophy, not because he succeeds, but because he continues. He finds his own kind of freedom in the repetition, refusing to be broken by his eternal task. Camus famously ends the myth of Sisyphus by stating, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." This provocative conclusion suggests that even in a life without inherent meaning, joy is possible. How? By rejecting the hope for ultimate answers or resolutions, Sisyphus transforms his condition from one of torment to one of agency. He knows the boulder will fall back every time, but instead of despairing, he accepts the reality of his situation and chooses to keep pushing it up the hill. It's in this persistent effort, in embracing the present moment, that Sisyphus finds his freedom. We can relate this to our own lives by considering how much of our mental energy is spent seeking outcomes, whether it's the completion of a project, achieving a goal, or solving a personal issue. We tend to think that once we reach the top of the hill, we'll finally be satisfied. But often when we do reach that point, we find that the satisfaction is fleeting, or that new challenges emerge. The boulder rolls back down. Camus's insight is that if we stop seeking meaning in the end result, and start finding meaning in the act of pushing itself, life becomes less of a burden. It's about shifting our focus from why we push the boulder to how we push it. Sisyphus's story resonates because it mirrors our everyday struggles. Picture a student who spends years working toward a degree, only to graduate and face the uncertainty of the job market. Or a person who works hard to maintain a relationship, only to see it fall apart. These experiences are common, yet they can feel deeply personal and existentially challenging. The question becomes, how do we cope with these cycles of effort and setback? Camus's message is not one of despair, but of resilience. Instead of seeking to escape the cycle, we should embrace it. By accepting the absurdity of existence, we liberate ourselves from the constant need for answers or closure. Life may not provide meaning, but it offers experience. And it's in the richness of experience, the highs, the lows, the mundane, that we can find a kind of fulfillment. In a world that often seems chaotic and indifferent, Sisyphus teaches us that the absence of meaning does not have to lead to nihilism or hopelessness. Instead, it can be an invitation to live fully in the present, to engage with life on its own terms, and to find joy in the act of living itself. By recognizing the limits of our control and the inevitability of life's repetitive cycles, we can approach existence with a renewed sense of purpose, not a purpose dictated by external forces or cosmic plans, but one that we create through our own choices and actions. Just as Sisyphus continues to push his boulder, so too can we continue to face life's challenges, not in search of ultimate meaning, but in celebration of the journey itself. The fear of freedom. The idea of freedom is often glorified, romanticized as the ultimate goal of human existence. Political freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of thought. These are all ideals that most societies strive toward. Yet within this very notion lies a profound and often hidden anxiety. What if freedom, rather than being the pure liberation we seek, also comes with overwhelming responsibility, uncertainty, and even isolation? This concept, famously explored by the psychoanalyst and philosopher Erich Fromm in his book Escape from Freedom, suggests that true freedom can be terrifying. The fear of freedom is not simply a reluctance to embrace autonomy, but a deep psychological dilemma that questions the very foundations of individual identity and societal roles. At its core, the fear of freedom stems from a paradox. On the one hand, we yearn to break free from external constraints, whether they are imposed by political systems, social norms, or familial expectations. Yet, on the other hand, once we attain this freedom, we are often left with the burden of self-determination. With no guiding hand or preordained path, the individual is forced to navigate a world of endless choices. And with choice comes the possibility of failure, regret, and the existential dread of facing a future where nothing is guaranteed. Fromm argues that this dilemma is particularly acute in modern industrialized societies. In earlier, more rigidly structured societies, individuals had clear roles to play. A farmer, a merchant, a warrior, they knew their place in the world. And while their lives were restricted in many ways, these restrictions also provided security. The modern individual, liberated from these traditional roles, is free but also profoundly alone. Without the safety net of predetermined identity, the responsibility of crafting one's life from scratch becomes a daunting task. Fromm's exploration of the fear of freedom echoes the existentialist themes of Jean-Paul Sartre, who famously claimed that humans are condemned to be free. Sartre's idea of radical freedom suggests that we are entirely responsible for creating meaning in our lives. In Sartre's view, there is no inherent meaning to life, no God, no universal truths to guide us. We are, in a sense, thrown into the world and forced to create purpose through our actions. But this freedom, Sartre argues, is not liberating in the way we might expect. Instead, it is a heavy burden. Every decision we make defines who we are, and with every choice, we could have chosen differently. Imagine standing at a crossroads with endless paths stretching out in every direction. While the freedom to choose your path may seem exciting, it also comes with the realization that each path chosen means a dozen paths left untraveled. The fear of making the wrong decision can paralyze us, leading to what psychologists today might call choice overload or decision fatigue. Sartre refers to this existential anxiety as anguish, the deep-seated fear that in our radical freedom, we are the sole architects of our lives, with no one else to blame if things go wrong. Faced with the overwhelming burden of freedom, Fromm suggests that many people seek to escape it. This escape doesn't always manifest as an overt rejection of freedom, but rather a subtle psychological retreat into systems of control and conformity. Fromm identifies two primary mechanisms of escape: submission to authority and the dissolution of individuality through conformity. The first escape route, submission to authority, involves surrendering one's freedom to a higher power, be it a political leader, a religious figure, or even an ideology. By aligning oneself with a powerful authority, the individual relinquishes the burden of making decisions and defining their own values. In exchange for safety and security, they trade away their autonomy. Second route, conformity, is less explicit but just as pervasive. In modern society, many people escape the anxiety of freedom by blending into the crowd, adopting the values, behaviors, and lifestyles of the majority. This creates the illusion of individuality while quietly erasing the need to confront true radical freedom. Fromm warns that this form of escape is particularly dangerous in democratic societies where the appearance of freedom masks a deeper conformity. The individual, though technically free, has become a cog in a vast social machine, moving according to the dictates of mass culture and consumerism. Fromm's analysis doesn't stop at identifying the fear of freedom. He also seeks to understand its psychological roots. He suggests that the desire to escape freedom is linked to feelings of powerlessness and isolation. When individuals lack a strong sense of self or a feeling of meaningful connection to others, freedom becomes an unbearable burden. It highlights their separateness and insignificance in a vast, impersonal world. This psychological tension is heightened in times of social upheaval or economic insecurity, when traditional structures are eroded and people are left to fend for themselves in an uncertain world. The appeal of authoritarianism and conformity becomes stronger. Historical examples abound. The rise of fascism in 20th century Europe, where individuals sought refuge in authoritarian regimes during periods of political and economic instability, is a chilling reminder of how easily the fear of freedom can lead to the erosion of democratic values. Despite his grim assessment of modern society's escape from freedom, Fromm offers a hopeful path forward. He argues that true freedom can be embraced if individuals cultivate a strong sense of self and engage in meaningful relationships with others. This requires what Fromm calls positive freedom, the ability to act not out of fear or obligation, but out of genuine self-expression and creativity. To live authentically, one must have the courage to face the existential anxiety that comes with freedom. This involves accepting that life is uncertain and that choices are fraught with risk. Yet, it also opens the possibility for growth, fulfillment, and the creation of meaning in a world that offers none. The fear of freedom, then, is not an obstacle to be avoided, but a challenge to be embraced. By confronting the anxiety that freedom brings, we can unlock a deeper, more fulfilling form of existence, one where we are not just passive participants in life, but active creators of our own destiny. The heat, death of universe. Imagine the universe as an enormous cosmic playground, where stars ignite, galaxies dance, and black holes quietly consume everything that crosses their path. Yet like all things, even this seemingly eternal playground must one day come to an end. Among the most haunting ideas about the universe's fate is the concept of the heat death. Unlike the dramatic cataclysms you might picture when you think of the universe's end, explosions, implosions, and supernovae, the heat death is a slow, cold, and silent march toward an ultimate equilibrium where the cosmos fades into a lifeless void. This idea, deeply rooted in the laws of thermodynamics, might not be as flashy as a supernova, but it is as inevitable as the ticking of a clock. To understand the heat death, we must first delve into the concept of entropy. In simple terms, entropy is the measure of disorder in a system. The second law of thermodynamics states that in a closed system, entropy always increases over time. It's a bit like a messy room. Unless someone actively cleans it, it will only get messier. And in this case, the room is the entire universe. Let's use a relatable example. Imagine you're holding a cup of hot coffee in a room. Over time, the heat from the coffee will spread to the surrounding air, and eventually the coffee will cool down to match the room's temperature. Energy in the form of heat naturally spreads from areas of high concentration, the coffee, to areas of lower concentration, the air, until everything is evenly balanced. This is entropy in action. Now, think of the entire universe like that cup of coffee, but on a grand scale. Over time, energy is spreading out, becoming more evenly distributed, until there will be no more high-energy sources like stars, no gradients to power any form of life or process. Everything will be in a state of maximum entropy. The universe, at present, is still teeming with energy. Stars burn brightly, black holes devour matter, and galaxies continue to evolve. However, this abundance of activity is not eternal. As time moves forward, billions, even trillions of years into the future, the stars will exhaust their nuclear fuel. One by one, they will burn out, becoming cold, dead remnants like white dwarfs, neutron stars, or black holes. But that's not the end of the story. Black holes, too, will eventually dissipate. Thanks to a phenomenon known as Hawking radiation, black holes aren't as eternal as we once thought. They will slowly leak energy over time, and after unimaginable epochs of time, even the largest black holes will evaporate into nothingness. At that point, the universe will consist only of a thin, sparse mist of particles, protons, electrons, and photons, drifting through an ever-expanding void. The temperature of the universe will approach absolute zero, and all processes that require energy will cease. The term heat death is a bit misleading, because rather than involving heat, it refers to a state where there is no usable energy left to do anything. The universe won't die in a blaze of fire. It will freeze, metaphorically and literally. There will be no stars to provide light or heat, no processes to sustain life, and no way to reverse this gradual decline into nothingness. In thermodynamic terms, the heat death occurs when the universe reaches thermal equilibrium, a state where all energy is uniformly spread out, and there are no more differences in temperature, pressure, or any other physical property that could drive motion or change. The idea of the heat death confronts us with a sobering truth about existence. Life, as we know it, depends on disequilibrium, on contrasts and gradients. Stars burn because of nuclear reactions fueled by differences in energy. Life thrives on Earth due to the energy input from the sun, and even our thoughts, powered by electrical signals in the brain, rely on energy disparities at the cellular level. In a universe at heat death, all of these processes would grind to a halt. In the absence of energy gradients, nothing can happen. It's not an explosion, not a collapse, but the quiet fading out of all activity. The universe will simply wind down like a toy left unattended, with no force to wind it back up again. This concept raises profound questions about the nature of time itself. Time, after all, is marked by change. But in a universe that has reached maximum entropy, where nothing can change, does time have any meaning at all? Without events to mark its passage, time may, in a sense, cease to exist. The timescales involved in the heat death are staggering. We're talking about events so far into the future that they are beyond human comprehension, trillions of years from now. The universe as we know it still has an unimaginable amount of time to continue its dance of creation and destruction. But the idea of the heat death reminds us that, just like life, the universe itself has a finite existence. It's a humbling thought. Our current universe, brimming with galaxies, stars, and life, is just a fleeting moment in the grand timeline of cosmic history. While we exist in the universe's vibrant youth, the heat death represents its ultimate old age, a quiet, still end after an eternity of dynamic, chaotic beauty. In the grand cosmic scheme, it's a reminder that everything, even the universe, follows the inexorable march of entropy towards stillness, and in that final silence, there will be no one left to witness it. Absurdity and revolt. Absurdity, as defined by philosopher Albert Camus, is the confrontation between the human desire for meaning and the indifferent, often chaotic, nature of the universe. It is the dissonance we experience when we seek purpose, coherence, and explanations in a world that offers none. Think of it as trying to solve a puzzle without all the pieces. No matter how hard you try, you're left with gaps, with the feeling that something essential is missing. This gap between our search for meaning and the universe's refusal to provide one is what Camus called the absurd. Yet the real philosophical challenge comes not in recognizing absurdity, but in responding to it. Camus famously posed the question, is life worth living? In his work, The Myth of Sisyphus, he argued that the fundamental question of philosophy isn't metaphysical or ethical, but rather existential, whether or not we should continue in the face of absurdity. To make sense of this, picture an individual standing at the edge of a vast, empty desert. This person is armed with a map, eager to explore and find something, anything, that gives them a sense of direction. But as they step forward, they soon realize the map is useless. It was never made for this terrain. The desert stretches endlessly, and no matter how far they walk, they find nothing but sand. It's not that the desert is hostile, it's indifferent. It offers no guidance, no meaning, and no clear path forward. This scenario mirrors our human condition. We enter life expecting it to make sense, seeking purpose, values, and clear answers. We look for signs, perhaps in religion, philosophy, or societal structures, hoping they will provide a framework to make sense of our experiences. But often, we find ourselves faced with the indifference of the world. The more we probe, the more we encounter uncertainty, randomness, and an absence of inherent meaning. This is absurdity, not a philosophical abstraction, but an everyday experience for many people. The sense of disorientation when plans fall apart, the shock of confronting mortality, the realization that life doesn't always follow a predictable or just path. The absurd is everywhere, waiting to be discovered in the gap between our expectations and reality. So, how should we respond to this dissonance? One option is despair, falling into nihilism and viewing life as pointless. But Camus proposes a different response, one that defies both despair and the false comforts of imposed meaning. Revolt. Revolt for Camus is not a one-time act of rebellion, but an ongoing stance toward life. It is the decision to live with the absurd, to embrace it without seeking escape through false hopes or resignation. Revolt is choosing to continue the search for meaning, even when we know it will always elude us. Here, Camus introduces the metaphor of Sisyphus, a figure from Greek mythology condemned to an eternal task of rolling a boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll back down every time he nears the top. For most, Sisyphus's punishment is tragic, a picture of futility and frustration. But for Camus, Sisyphus is the ultimate hero. He embodies revolt because despite the hopelessness of his task, he keeps pushing. His defiance lies not in the expectation of success, but in his persistence. In this act, Sisyphus transcends his punishment. Camus famously concludes, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." This, in essence, is the spirit of revolt. It is not about solving the absurd, but about living fully in its presence. It is about continuing to search, act, and live without needing to reconcile the contradictions of existence. The meaning we create through our actions, despite the indifference of the universe, is our form of revolt. How does this look in our daily lives? Revolt manifests in small, everyday acts of persistence, choosing to create, even when creation seems futile, choosing to love, even when love is transient, choosing to live authentically, even when authenticity offers no promise of reward or understanding. Take the example of an artist who paints without any guarantee of success or recognition, or a teacher who educates students in a world filled with misinformation, or even a parent raising a child in a world that offers no assurances about the future. These acts of creation, love, and care are rebellions against the absurd. They are small but profound moments of revolt, where individuals, despite the knowledge of futility, choose to engage with life fully. What Camus is suggesting is not a life of resigned despair, but one of passionate engagement. In revolt, we find our freedom, not from the absurd, but within it. By accepting that the universe owes us nothing, we paradoxically discover the freedom to create our own meaning. Rather than being weighed down by the need for answers, we can focus on the experience of living itself. Absurdity may seem like a nihilistic concept at first glance, but Camus's philosophy offers a deeply empowering message. The realization that life has no preordained meaning does not lead to despair, but to liberation. The freedom of revolt lies in the understanding that, even if the universe is indifferent, our actions and choices still matter, precisely because we choose them, and because we persist in the face of the absurd. By acknowledging the absurd and choosing revolt, we reclaim our agency in a universe that offers none. And in that act of defiance, we find the seeds of an authentic, lived freedom, the nature of human evil. Evil has been a subject of human contemplation for millennia, a concept that has haunted philosophical, religious, and psychological discourse. What drives individuals to commit acts of cruelty, violence, or indifference to suffering? Is evil an external force that influences us, or is it an intrinsic part of human nature? Exploring these questions requires a deep dive into the nature of human evil, a concept that refuses to be neatly categorized or explained. At its core, human evil can be viewed from various perspectives, ranging from metaphysical and religious views to psychological and sociological interpretations. Each perspective offers a unique lens through which to understand the darker sides of human behavior. In many religious traditions, evil is externalized, personified in figures like Satan or demonic forces that tempt or corrupt humans. In this view, humans are born with the potential for good, but are susceptible to the influence of malevolent forces. Evil exists as a metaphysical reality, an opposite to good, and human beings must struggle to overcome it. For instance, Christianity posits the idea of original sin where evil entered the world through the fall of Adam and Eve. According to this view, human beings are inherently flawed due to this primordial act of disobedience, and it is only through divine grace that they can overcome their sinful nature. This theological framework places evil outside the self, as something to resist and avoid. However, some philosophies, like that of Gnosticism, take a more dualistic approach, viewing the material world itself as corrupt or evil, with the human spirit trapped within it. In these views, the battle between good and evil is played out on a cosmic scale, with humanity caught in the struggle. But when we turn to modern philosophy and psychology, the explanation for human evil shifts from external metaphysical forces to internal psychological mechanisms. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, believed that human behavior is driven by unconscious desires and instincts, particularly the conflict between the life drive eros and the death drive thanatos. The latter, thanatos, is the force within us that seeks destruction, aggression, and ultimately death. Freud viewed these destructive impulses as natural, if repressed, parts of the human psyche. In his framework, evil is not an external force but an inherent part of human nature, something to be understood and managed rather than banished. This view is expanded by more recent psychological theories, particularly the banality of evil, a term coined by political theorist Hannah Arendt in her analysis of Bureaucrat Adolf Eichmann. Arendt suggested that great evil often arises not from a deliberate embrace of wickedness, but from ordinary people who follow orders without questioning the moral implications of their actions. Eichmann, who organized the logistics of the Holocaust, did not appear to be a monster in the traditional sense. He was a man doing his job efficiently, devoid of empathy or reflection. Arendt's concept challenges the idea that evil is always a result of grand malevolence. Instead, it suggests that ordinary, everyday individuals can become perpetrators of evil when they stop reflecting on their actions and fall into moral disengagement. This leads to a more chilling realization. Evil can emerge not just from those who actively choose to do harm, but from the passive compliance of ordinary people. Social and systemic factors also play a crucial role in shaping human evil. Sociologist Philip Zimbardo, in his famous Stanford prison experiment, demonstrated how ordinary people could commit acts of cruelty when placed in positions of power and authority. Participants in the study, who were assigned the role of prison guards, quickly began to exhibit abusive behavior towards those playing the role of prisoners. The study highlighted how systems of power can corrupt individuals, leading them to commit acts of evil they might never have imagined in different circumstances. Zimbardo's work aligns with the idea that human evil is often situational. Under the right conditions, such as dehumanizing systems, a lack of accountability, or extreme ideologies, ordinary people can be driven to commit extraordinary acts of cruelty. This understanding of evil moves away from the individual and looks at the structures and environments that foster and perpetuate evil behaviors. One might assume that empathy is the antidote to human evil, but even empathy has its dark side. Paul Bloom, in his book Against Empathy, argues that empathy can actually exacerbate cruelty rather than prevent it. This happens when empathy becomes selective, focused only on those we care about or identify with, while dehumanizing others. For instance, an individual may feel empathy for their family or group while justifying violence or oppression towards others. In this way, empathy can fuel tribalism, xenophobia, and cruelty when it becomes a tool for reinforcing in-group versus out-group dynamics. This complexity adds another layer to the nature of human evil. It is not only the absence of empathy, but the selective application of it that can lead to harm. To better understand the nature of human evil, imagine it as a vast, dark forest. Some people stand on the edges of the forest, never entering, content to remain in the light. Others may venture in, only to return quickly when they sense the dangers lurking in the shadows. But some walk deeper into the woods, compelled by curiosity, power, or fear. Once inside, the paths become less clear. The trees grow denser and the light begins to fade. It is easy to become lost, disoriented, and consumed by the forest's darkness. Some enter the forest willingly, drawn by power, malice, or revenge. Others stumble into it, guided by fear, ignorance, or passivity, and find that the further they go, the harder it is to turn back. Yet the forest is not an external force. It is a part of us. Each of us carries within us the potential to enter that forest, to get lost within its depths, and to struggle to find our way back to the light. This metaphor captures the multifaceted nature of human evil. It is not an external entity waiting to ensnare us, but something that resides within each of us, an inherent potential shaped by our experiences, choices, and environments. Human evil is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. It can arise from individual psychology, social structures, or situational factors. It can be driven by the absence of empathy or even by selective empathy. Whether we view it through a religious lens as an external force or a psychological one as a facet of human nature, the dark side of humanity requires constant reflection and awareness. Understanding the nature of human evil is not about finding simple answers, but about confronting the uncomfortable truth that under the right circumstances, any of us could contribute to it. Only through constant self-awareness, moral reflection, and a commitment to empathy for all can we hope to counteract the potential for evil within ourselves and society. Radical skepticism. Radical skepticism is a philosophical position that questions the possibility of certain or reliable knowledge. It represents the extreme version of skepticism, where one doubts not just specific beliefs or claims, but the very foundation of knowledge itself. A radical skeptic might ask, how do we know that anything we experience or believe is true? And often goes further to suggest that we may not know anything at all with certainty. To understand radical skepticism, let's begin with the more basic form of skepticism. Ordinary skepticism is a questioning attitude or doubt regarding claims of knowledge. It is the critical examination of beliefs, asking for evidence before accepting anything as true. This kind of skepticism is a valuable tool in everyday life and scientific inquiry. After all, doubting what we hear and challenging assumptions often leads to discovery and better understanding. Radical skepticism, however, takes this doubt to its logical extreme. It doesn't merely question specific beliefs like, can I trust my senses? Or, how do I know if others are telling the truth? Instead, it challenges the very possibility of knowledge. What if everything we experience is an illusion? What if the reality we think we perceive is not the true reality at all? This form of skepticism is often associated with philosophers like René Descartes, David Hume, and Pyrrho of Elis. A classic example of radical skepticism comes from René Descartes in the 17th century. Descartes famously asked, "What if everything I perceive is just a dream?" This is the foundation of his dream argument, which suggests that there is no clear way to distinguish between waking life and dreams. After all, when we are dreaming, we often believe that the dream is real, only to realize it was false upon waking. So how can we be certain that what we call waking life is not just another, more consistent dream? Descartes extended this idea into what is known as his method of doubt. He systematically doubted everything that could possibly be doubted, including the evidence of his senses, the existence of the physical world, and even the reliability of mathematics and logic. The only thing Descartes found that he could not doubt was the existence of his own mind as a thinking entity, famously encapsulated in his phrase, cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. While Descartes used this extreme doubt as a tool to rebuild his philosophy from a foundation of certainty, radical skeptics maintain the position that doubt can never be fully escaped. What if even our thoughts are deceiving us? What if there is no real certainty at all? The philosopher David Hume took radical skepticism in another direction, by questioning our knowledge of cause and effect. For Hume, even something as seemingly obvious as causality, the idea that one event leads to another, is not something we can know with certainty. Instead, it is simply a habit of mind. When we see the sun rise every morning, we expect it to rise again the next day, not because we have certain knowledge that it will, but because we've seen it rise repeatedly in the past. Hume's skepticism went further to question whether we can ever have true knowledge of the external world, or of anything beyond our immediate perceptions. According to Hume, we experience only a series of impressions, colors, sounds, sensations, and we cannot know for sure what causes these impressions. For all we know, they could be illusions. This is a radical departure from the common sense view of the world, which assumes that things exist independently of our perceptions. For Hume, the idea that there is a stable external world is just a convenient assumption, not something we can prove. In more recent philosophy, radical skepticism has been explored through thought experiments like the brain in a vat scenario. Imagine a scenario where your brain is removed from your body and placed in a vat of nutrients, connected to a supercomputer that simulates all your sensory experiences. According to this hypothesis, everything you see, hear, feel, and think could be generated by the computer, and you would have no way of knowing whether you are in the real world or in a simulation. This is a modern version of the skeptical concerns that Descartes raised with his evil demon thought experiment, in which he imagined an all-powerful deceiver manipulating his perceptions. In both cases, the skeptic argues that for all we know, we could be fundamentally deceived about everything. There is no way to prove, beyond any doubt, that we are not living in a simulated reality or under the influence of some external deception. While radical skepticism raises important questions about the limits of human knowledge, it also leads to profound challenges. If we accept the skeptical position fully, we would be paralyzed by doubt. We wouldn't be able to trust our senses, our reasoning, or even the most basic facts about reality. This has led some philosophers to argue that radical skepticism is self-defeating. After all, even doubting presupposes some form of knowledge, such as the knowledge that doubt is possible. In response to radical skepticism, philosophers have proposed various strategies. Some argue for fallibilism, the idea that while we can never be absolutely certain about anything, we can still have reliable, though imperfect, knowledge. Others propose pragmatism, which suggests that beliefs should be judged by their practical consequences rather than by whether they meet the impossible standard of certainty. To grasp the concept of radical skepticism, imagine you're walking through a thick fog. You can see faint shapes in the distance, but you can't be sure if they're real or just illusions created by the mist. Every step forward is uncertain, and while you may feel confident in some moments, the deeper you go, the more you question whether the path you're on is even real. This is the experience of the radical skeptic in a never-ending journey through uncertainty where nothing can be trusted completely and every assumption might be an illusion. Radical skepticism forces us to confront the fragility of human knowledge. By questioning the very possibility of certainty, it challenges our assumptions about reality, perception, and belief. While it may be unsettling to think that we might not know anything with complete certainty, radical skepticism is also a valuable tool in pushing the boundaries of inquiry and ensuring that we remain critical and reflective about what we accept as true. In the end, the true value of radical skepticism may lie not in its conclusions, but in the questions it forces us to ask. The death of God. When Friedrich Nietzsche famously declared, "God is dead," he wasn't speaking in literal terms. He wasn't announcing the demise of a divine being in some physical sense, but rather he was pointing to the profound cultural and existential shift that had taken place in Western civilization. The phrase represents a radical upheaval in the human condition, a recognition that the framework of meaning and morality that had dominated the West for centuries had collapsed. The 19th century, when Nietzsche wrote these words, was a time of scientific advancement, industrialization, and growing secularism. The reliance on religion as the primary source of moral and existential guidance was beginning to wane. The Enlightenment had placed reason and science at the center of human inquiry, eroding the once solid foundation of faith that had structured society. Nietzsche's death of God is a metaphor for this cultural transformation, the evaporation of a world where meaning was handed down from divine authority. But what does it mean, on a more personal level, for God to be dead? Nietzsche wasn't simply bemoaning the loss of religious belief. Instead, he saw it as a crisis and an opportunity. Without the anchor of a transcendent moral code, humanity was cast into a state of existential freedom. This newfound freedom, however, came at a cost. Without God, there is no inherent meaning to life, no ultimate purpose. The world, once infused with divine significance, now appears indifferent, empty, and chaotic. Nietzsche's vision of the death of God leads directly into the idea of nihilism, the belief that life lacks intrinsic value or meaning. With no divine order to guide us, human beings face the daunting realization that we must create meaning for ourselves. This, for Nietzsche, was both a terrifying and liberating prospect. It meant that humanity was no longer bound by the constraints of religious dogma, but it also meant that individuals were now solely responsible for constructing their own moral and existential framework. The death of God isn't merely a statement about religion. It's a reflection of the human struggle with meaning in the modern age. It signals the end of a particular worldview in which moral and existential truths were given from above. For Nietzsche, the question was not whether God existed, but how humanity would cope with the vacuum left in God's absence. He saw this as the central crisis of modernity. In the wake of this declaration, Nietzsche introduces the concept of the Übermensch, or Overman, a figure who would rise above the collapse of traditional values and create new ones. The Übermensch embodies the idea that without divine moral authority, humans have the potential to transcend old ways of thinking and create their own path. But this task isn't for the faint-hearted. The death of God demands a re-evaluation of every aspect of life: morality, purpose, existence itself. It's a call to reject the comforts of passive belief and face the abyss of meaninglessness head-on. To understand Nietzsche's philosophy is to grapple with the consequences of a world where God is no longer the ultimate source of truth. In many ways, Nietzsche believed the death of God was a necessary step in human evolution. It forced people to confront the fragility of their belief systems and to take responsibility for their lives in ways they never had before. It is in this vacuum of meaning that Nietzsche believed true creativity and freedom could arise. Nietzsche was also deeply aware of the danger that the death of God posed. He recognized that many would not be able to handle this loss, and instead of rising to the challenge of creating new values, they might fall into despair, cynicism, or nihilism. The death of God could lead to a moral and existential freefall if not met with courage and determination to find or forge new meaning. Thus, Nietzsche's proclamation isn't just a critique of religion. It's a reflection on the human condition. The death of God is not simply the end of an era, but the beginning of a new and uncertain one. It asks us to confront uncomfortable questions. If there is no higher power guiding us, what then? How do we navigate a world stripped of absolute meaning? And perhaps most importantly, can we rise to the challenge of creating a new vision for human life? The death of God may sound like a bleak, dark proposition, but Nietzsche didn't see it as the end of hope. Rather, it was the starting point for the possibility of human greatness. It was an invitation to overcome the limitations of the past and imagine new possibilities for the future. In a world where we no longer look to the heavens for answers, the task of creating meaning falls squarely on our own shoulders. It is a heavy burden, but for Nietzsche, it was also the key to human potential.